sometimes you can use the same weight for 4 weeks, but it gets more explosive. It feels more explosive over the 4 weeks. And it will get to a point to where now it feels like it's too light. It doesn't have to be a week to week progression, but then after the 4 weeks, it's really good.
Yeah. After I got through that initial feeling of like, what the did I just do? I was like, this is it. It was the first thing that related to everything else that I had done in my life. The things that I loved doing that weren't weight training, I loved the power of it. And that's when I was like, this is my missing link.
It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk.
All right, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Curtis Miller, founder of Inbound Strength. Over a decade as a competitive powerlifter with best lifts of 804, 440, 777, 2,000 total. But aside from that, you've competed in the 198s, 220, 242, 275. So there's
not 275.
Not the 275?
I should have.
On open powerlifting, it was that class, or was it not that class?
Oh, no. You're right. My last meet that I did.
But you weren't really 270.
Yeah. I think I was 249. Okay. I went in there, I was injured, so I was just doing bench only.
Yeah.
And I was like, screw it. Right. let's get up to 250 if we can. So I forgot about that one.
Well, see, now I know more about your powerlifting career than you do.
Right.
It's kind of messed up, right? Yeah. You've been in this industry, the strength and fitness industry, for, I'm going to say close to 20 years, like 17 years. And have been the whole gambit, because you started out working at a front desk.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And then so you go from, over a long period of time, you've been at the front desk, you've been cleaning toilets, you've been working as a personal trainer, then a manager. Now you're a business owner and a coach, both for a long time in person and online, mostly now online. So there's a whole lot to talk about there as well. And a husband and father. And you didn't really discover the weight room until college.
Yeah, pretty much.
So with all you guys that I bring out from, because you're lifter and coach, so there's two different avatars that are kind of associated with this. From the lifter perspective, something that I'm always fascinated in, and because you've studied all this, early childhood development does carry over, into athletics because of the different motor abilities that are developed during different phases of life. So just because you weren't in the weight room, explosive strength, stuff like that, it's all developed. Spatial awareness, all these things are developed early years. So what were you doing in those earlier years to help develop any of those attributes?
Man, this was attributed to my parents. Growing up, obviously playing sports, but when I wasn't in the season playing sports, I was doing a lot of stuff outside. I was helping my dad split firewood. He was a bricklayer, so I was doing side jobs with him, laying bricks at 14 years old.
Even earlier, what were you doing?
Before that, I actually had a construction job at 12.
All right, any Pee-wee leagues? Yeah.
So at 5 years old, playing soccer, playing t-ball.
Okay.
And then from there all the way through high school. If it wasn't bad weather outside, I was outside doing something.
All right.
Racing dirt bikes and four-wheelers, playing sports, chopping firewood, like I said, just a lot of hands-on work. When I was 15, the summer job that I had in between school and while not playing sport, actually during my time playing sports, I worked for this party rental company. It put up the huge wedding tents, right? Like 40 by 100 tents, and the stakes that you have to drive into the ground are 3.5 feet long, and they're that big around. And during the summer, the ground is hard as shit. And we didn't have, like nowadays, they have jackhammers to drive the stakes down.
So you're using the old school post hole?
Oh, we had sledgehammers. And so I'm swinging at 14, 15 years old. They wouldn't let me swing the smaller sledgehammers. So I had to learn how to swing a 20-pound sledgehammer. And when I say swing it, I mean like windmill it.
Oh, you have to. Yeah.
You have to. So, that developed so much strength and power and coordination. And I did that. I would do that, 10 hours a day and then go play a baseball game in like a summer league or something like that. So and this is during the time I had never even touched a barbell yet. Maybe in in the spare bedroom where my dad had some free weights. But besides that, no.
Was it discouraged with, what sports did you play in high school?
Baseball and soccer.
All right. So those are two sports where they're kind of, they're not anti, but they're not putting it in your face.
And you're talking about the early 2000s too.
Yeah.
So there wasn't, I mean, there was still really good knowledge out there, but where I grew up, so small town, you know, they didn't encourage it.
Yeah.
We had one baseball coach who tried to get us to go into the weight room, but I didn't do it, you know, because my soccer coach was like, we're going on long runs every day. Before practice, we would go on 5-mile runs through the woods and then come back and start practice, because he felt like if we could out-condition the team, then we would ultimately beat them in the last part of the game. And most of the time it worked.
Yeah.
You know, so not a lot of lifting.
So who were you in high school then? You know, because high school's got these cliques, right? Yeah. So are you the jock clique? What?
I was part of like the country gang.
The country gang.
Yeah. Had, you know, wore work boots to school every day, you know, Dickie work pants, you know, had to get yelled at to take my hat off every day in school.
Was that the whole school?
No, it wasn't. Very small town on the Eastern Shore, Denton.
Yeah.
It's population like 2,000 people. It might be 3,000 now, but it was divided because of, I would say, like, you had a lot of agricultural stuff there. Mm-hmm. So you had a lot of people moving, and it didn't cost a lot to live there. So you had a mix of demographics coming in and doing a lot of blue collar jobs. There weren't a lot of tech jobs, you know, that was across the Bay Bridge, Baltimore, DC, you know, stuff like that. So, I mean, you had a little bit of everything as far as demographics go.
How did that integrate for, say, your soccer team?
I mean, we were great because we had, you know, there were a few guys that were on the team that were Hispanic, and they grew up, you know, as soon as they could walk, they were playing soccer.
Yeah, they're born with a soccer.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you're playing with those guys, and they become your friends, and I mean, it was a lot of fun.
All right, so you're kind of like the country boy can't survive guy.
Yeah.
You know, in the school.
Yeah, definitely. But I think I always, you know, my parents were very athletic, so they played sports growing up. My dad grew up on a farm, so they were always playing sports, wrestling, hanging out. So the athleticism seemed to come very easy for me. So although in my free time, I may have been, you know, working and riding dirt bikes, when I was on the field, that's all I cared about. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to be the best that I could. And it was when I was probably like 16, we started going to some pitching clinics. And it was expensive. You know, it's still expensive. But at the time, it was an indoor facility that was unlike anything around. It was like Delmarva baseball, I think. Jamie Evans was a really good pitching coach back then. And he had just opened this indoor facility. And they had pitching mounds in there, dirt pitching mounds. And it was so dry. And my dad, we could only afford to take me there like once a month or something. And Jamie was like, man, it's so dusty in here. I wish I could keep it, you know, keep the dust down. And my dad was like, well, what if I brought, you know, a 55-gallon drum of water and I watered it down every time? And we lived an hour away. Mm-hmm. We'd drive an hour. And he was like, dude, you do that. Like, I'll help you out on a deal to get Curtis to come in here more often. So that's how I ended up going there. And we would go there every Saturday. Mm-hmm. And I would go pitch. And he was legitimately one of the best pitching coaches at the time.
How were your academics? How did you view that? I mean, were you thinking that you were going to go minors or something like that? Was that an aspiration?
Yeah, but between that and being a NASCAR driver, mm-hmm. like that was, I know that sounds silly to say, but I grew up around cars. I grew up around racing and things that go fast. Yeah. And that was my true passion.
Yeah. And that's very expensive.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You had my friends who were into that, like their parents own, you know, these big contracting companies and things like that. And they could afford some of those things, but, you know, we never could. And then it was baseball. Mm-hmm. And I thought about it, but I never thought I was really good enough. And to this day, I mean, I feel like I could have played in college and maybe gone a little past that. But I think at a young age, I just realized like how challenging that was, especially where I grew up. It was very hard to get scouts to come out there.
Mm-hmm. So what created the pivot to go into automotive? Because that's essentially where you went after high school.
Yeah. So that was, in high school, my senior year, a majority of my classes were auto tech classes. And I was preparing to get into that field. And my senior year of high school.
Now, was that part of the school or was it a separate school?
It was a VOTEC school.
Okay.
But it was on the property at
the same property though.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we would have the other high school in the county. Our county had 2 high schools.
Yeah.
So that high school would come over. They would take a bus every day and come over and for like 4 periods.
All right. So it's essentially a trade school that's on the same premises. So you're not removed from the whole population, because a lot of the trade schools here are far removed,
right.
So that becomes its own population, I suppose. So that makes more sense. So you're in there, and how long was that in high school? I mean, how long was the focus there?
Yeah. So that was the whole senior year.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't remember if it was 2 semesters. I don't even know how it is anymore, but yeah, the first part of the year, you're going in there and you're taking a certain group of classes, like the beginner classes,
yeah.
Right? And then you get into the more advanced stuff, the second part of high school. And that was during the time where I actually had, they're not recruits, but I guess like spokesmen who come from the local colleges, and they're not even local, but there was one in Exton, PA, I think, called Universal Technical Institute, maybe. And then there was one in Blairsville, PA, which is close to Pittsburgh, WyoTech. And that's where I ended up going. So it started in September, the year that I graduated high school. So 2007, I went from graduating high school, worked, 2 to 3 months, and then went straight to college with 99% dudes.
Yeah.
Who were all a bunch of assholes. We all were like, you're 18 years old,
And how long was that?
That was a year. So they treated it like a legitimate job. So it was 8 to 4 every day. And it was nonstop. You got one 7-day break that whole year. You might've got 2. But it was a year straight of just work every day. And they made we had like a shaving policy. So they would line us up, like once a week and make sure we were clean shaven. Like it was a job.
Yeah. Well, that's what they're preparing you for.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Now, is that the time where you started training?
Yeah. So I took up they had the apartment complex where I lived. They had this little small like fitness center. And they had like a lat pull down, a leg extension, and a Smith machine. And the Smith machine that's not fixed, it actually, the rails can move front and back and up and down. So I started.
That's interesting, right? Yeah. Because that's a specialty piece.
Yeah. It was a really nice piece.
Where you wouldn't find in something like that.
Yeah. So that's where one day I got under the bar and I don't even know what made me think about it. Probably seeing a lot of the kids in high school squat. And I got and keep in mind, I was strong. I was skinny, but I was strong. I weighed like 145 pounds. And I put like a plate on each side, which is not 135 because the bar is weightless pretty much. And I get under it and I do like 5 reps and I tweak my hamstring. Like no lie. And I was like, man, maybe this isn't for me, So I basically got some dumbbells from the local Walmart and I just did like some dumbbell press and chest flies in my apartment. I didn't even want to go. I was kind of embarrassed. So I didn't even want to go back down into that weight room.
Was this more just for vanity's sake?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to break up the time, we were in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. There's nothing to do. And you're hanging out with all guys all the time. So you wake up, you go to class, you come back, you got a little bit of time, you get something to eat. And then I would do like 30 minutes of working out. And then we get together and we either go get in mischief or we sit there and play like Mario Kart on Nintendo 64 all night. And that's what it was for a year.
Yeah. When did the training start to become more serious?
That was after college. I got my first job and I was working in a body shop, and we were doing a lot of restoration stuff, which was exactly what I wanted. Now, this was in 2008 and the economy had just tanked pretty hard. Mm-hmm. I remember gas in Blairsville, gas was like $4.30 a gallon. And in 2008, that was insane. Mm-hmm. And the shop that I was working at closed down, or they ultimately closed down. I got laid off. And my friend at the time, he's like, hey man, I know you're kind of down. You'll find another job. Let's go to the gym. I was like, dude, I have no idea what to do in the gym. And this is at the time, this was at my old high school. And after hours, they had an open gym, and it was like $1. You pay $1 and you could come in there after the school was closed and you could work out. So
are you back home now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the job was closer to where you grew up.
Yeah. It was an hour from where I grew up.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, I start going there with him, and this is no lie. The first day I'm in there, and I didn't really know how to bench press. I knew how to deadlift because I'm used to picking stuff up off the ground, but I was doing lat pull downs. And the football coach, who was also my history teacher when I was in high school, Mr. Joseph, thank you. He comes in with the football team. And it was like a scene from a movie. It felt like the music stopped, like skirt. And he's like, Miller, what the hell are you doing here? Are you lost or something? And I was like, shit, exactly what I was scared would happen. So I just kept showing up, and it pissed me off a little bit, you know, and I used it for something good, and I kept coming back. And then he would come in there, and he would always he wouldn't say much. He'd be like, doing good. And he was intense. I mean, he was super intense, both as a teacher. He was a great teacher, both as a teacher and a football coach. One day I fell asleep in his history class, and he threw an aluminum bat at me, and it hit my desk. You know, like you can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
But no, he was very serious, you know, and to get that compliment after a little while from him was really cool. So I just kept showing up.
When you say intense and serious, you can perceive that two ways, sure. Right? You can think that this is an asshole, right? So then you don't really want his respect. Mm-hmm. So what about his personality made you kind of crave that respect? Well, not crave, but like the respect.
He was a leader.
Okay.
And, you know, our football team, you know, the guys who I grew up with who played football, some of the best football players I've ever seen in person. Unfortunately, they weren't able to go on just because of where we grew up. You know, they weren't able to go on after college, but he just brought that out of you. And even in the classroom, like, he was a no nonsense guy, but he was great at teaching you. And anytime you had to talk to him about something, like stay after class, talk to him, he was, you know, open and you could talk to him about everything. But when it came time to either practice or play or train, he was business. Mm-hmm. And that's how all of the people who I looked up to when I was growing up, that's how they were. You know, that's how my dad was.
Mm-hmm. So how are you, when you're going in there at this time, how are you determining what exercises you're doing?
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting to me because I never really had a time kind of like that.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of fell into more structured I guess there was a certain period of time.
Right.
So was it like muscle and fitness? You're just flipping through there and like, that looks good, I'm going to do that.
Yeah. Well, that was second. First, it was just watching what everybody else was doing. So I legitimately would go in there and be like, what's that? And then I would kind of try that out and see how it felt. And then I got muscle and fitness magazines. So of course you're kind of getting into bodybuilding style stuff. I still wasn't really squatting, benching, or deadlifting quite yet, but it was really my brother. My brother was fighting MMA at the time, and he asked me one day, he was like, hey man, you should go to the gym with me. We're going to get a workout on a Saturday morning. And I was like, yeah, what time? He goes, well, we get there at 6 a.m. And I'm 18, 19 years old. I'm going to bed at midnight, you know, 1 a.m. So I would get to his house at 5 a.m. Saturday morning, and he would take me to the gym with him. And then I remember he gave me Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. Right?
500 movements.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I took it home and I still have it to this day. I highlighted like everything in the book and I did everything in there. And so it was a combination of Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. And then my parents, for like my birthday, got me a subscription to Muscle and Fitness.
All right. So a high volume is basically what you ended up doing.
Yeah. And I loved it.
Yeah. And you were making progress on it because it's the beginning.
Right, exactly.
But the other interesting side of that is because it's higher volume and you're younger, there's more opportunities to figure out what the movement should feel like.
Exactly.
Right.
You're doing more repetitions.
It will evolve over time.
Yep.
You know, so did you know it was evolving over time during that first year? Like for pull downs, for example, or just because when you first start doing it, maybe your arms get a little pumped.
Yeah.
Right. Then once you start to figure it out, then you get like a lat pump.
Yeah.
Right. Did it follow that process? You started to figure out what muscles you were supposed to work, and then you start tweaking your technique to try to get a better pump out of it would be the easiest way to explain that.
Yeah. And that, I think, you know, growing up, I was always like building things. I was always trying to figure out how things work, how they move, efficiency. So when I'm doing these exercises, I'm like constantly in my mind tweaking something, like each rep, each set. And it was all for feeling at that point. It wasn't to see how much weight I could move. I just wanted to feel the movement correctly. And I didn't know what that meant, right? That you're just experimenting. So I'm like, where am I feeling this? The magazine says that this exercise is working this muscle group. What do I need to adjust to feel it in that muscle group and not in my biceps and forearms?
Now, during this time, you're training with your friend, right?
Well, so...
Or did he like bow out?
He got in a really bad car accident.
Yeah, I guess he bowed out.
Yeah. So he got in a really bad car accident and, man, they didn't know if he was going to live. And I would go and visit him in the hospital. He wasn't able to talk. And he ultimately had to wear one of those halos around his head. And I just told myself, I was like, part of me is going to keep going to the gym because I'm starting to love it. The other part is for him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it started.
What I'm trying to figure out is how, and you may have ended up still muscle fucking everything later down the road, but how you ended up in that initial phase more concerned about how it's supposed to feel instead of just lifting more weight, because that's what pretty much everybody does.
Yeah.
So this is interesting because you weren't doing that.
Yeah. You're a psychiatrist. You don't realize that, but you're making me think of these things that I've never thought of before, which is cool. It's because when I would go home and look in the mirror, I was getting farther and farther away from feeling like a 145-pound kid. So when I would feel these certain muscles working and I could go in there and my dad would, you know, where I grew up, you walk around with no shirt on all the time. And my dad be like, hey boy, your back's looking good, man. Your shoulders are looking good. Your arms are looking good. So that's where that training evolved. You know, I was always strong. I wasn't worried about that, but I wanted to look better. Mm-hmm. You know, I was, you know, a little bit self-conscious about being that small because all my friends who were these great athletes were what I considered big and I wasn't. So that's a big part of why I first started or what drove my training the first year or two.
Now, during that time where because you said walking around with your shirt off and you flexing in the mirror and shit like that too.
Yeah.
It sounds funny, right? But there is, you're in a way developing this mind muscle connection.
That's right.
Right? Because you can start flexing your chest, right? Everybody and biceps.
Right.
And did that go further than just like chest and biceps to where you were seeing if you could actually just flex your quads or your lats and all that just in a sitting position?
Yeah, definitely. Because that was, and this is one of the biggest things that I took from Arnold's Encyclopedia. He always to this day, talks about the mind muscle connection. So within that first year, which I feel like a lot of people don't do in their first year, I'm sure there are, but I'm sitting there and I'm on the leg, and I can remember this day, the first day that I sat down, I was on the leg extension machine and I closed my eyes and I'm just performing it one leg at a time, single leg extension. And I'm trying to feel what he was talking about. And then I started applying that to everything I was doing.
Well, I believe that. And as a coach, I mean, we'll get into this deeper as we go through this podcast, but I think that's an important skill to develop as soon as you possibly can, because if you're now working with an intermediate powerlifter and you're trying to explain to engage the triceps, but they don't even know how to fucking flex their tricep, and we're talking lats, which is going to be a way bigger issue. Like they'll probably know the triceps indirectly are going to kind of come around, right? But when you're talking about things like, tension in the hamstrings or the lats or rhomboids, traps, I mean, you should be in a seated position, flex anything. I should say, right? If I say it, you'll do it. That's right. Contract your lats, and you probably just did it, right? So that gets developed through those mechanisms, right? And that's why this is interesting to me that you were doing this first, right? Because what normally will happen is and I get it, right? Because the progressive overload person will add more weight. It's not wrong, but that's the route they go. And then they get to a certain point and you're like, well, wait a minute, where do you feel this?
Right.
And the lat pull down, well, with my biceps.
Yeah.
It's actually not working in your biceps. Right. You need to feel this and that. So now you got to go back, right? The weight has to drop, which becomes hard to comprehend to somebody that's worked so hard to get the stack and 3 45-pound weights with things on there, to now use half the stack to be able to do it. But if they can embrace that, then the pump they get is way bigger. Then it's a different conversation.
That's right.
We doing this for strength, we doing it for hypertrophy. What's the reason? And so that's very interesting to me. So when did the powerlifting become in the fold and how that happened?
Well, and I forget exactly when this was, but it was during that time in one of the muscle and fitness magazines. They would randomly drop some powerlifting stuff in there.
Yeah, like one article once a quarter.
It might have been an article that you wrote. I don't know. It was so long ago, but there was somebody benching against bands, and it was like, attach these bands to your bench press and do. Yeah, right.
You've been training for like a year.
Yeah. And it was like, do 10 triples.
Yeah.
At, this percentage. And I was like, where the hell do I get these bands from? So I go on Google and I type in, rubber bands for rubber bands for bench pressing. And where do you think it brought me? Yes.
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah. elitefts.com, discount code table talk.
So I ordered the mini bands. So like the orange ones, the green ones, the red ones. And I was benching against those.
Okay.
And it was insane band tension. But that's around the time when, that day I might have ordered bands. But the next day I found the articles, and every night until 2 a.m., 3 a.m., I was reading articles, because that's at a time where YouTube wasn't really a thing quite yet.
Yeah.
I mean, Pete Rubish was on there going nuts in his mom's basement.
Yeah.
But besides that, there wasn't a lot of quality info on YouTube. And besides books, which I wasn't in college yet, so I hadn't really experimented with books. The articles on Elite FTS is really what just drove me crazy, being so intense with studying and reading everything.
How did you navigate because with the content that we've always put out, I never wanted to have a bias on the content, right? Which means there's going to be a lot of different training methodologies and philosophies. Now we don't have bullshit on there, but there's a lot of different perspectives. So as a new person coming in, it's not like you're just going to land on this one website that's only feeding one perspective, which in a way would be easier to kind of follow, right? Because there's that path is biased as hell,
right? Yeah, exactly.
Maybe not right, but paved, where we've never had this paved path. So how are you navigating that without... That's the wrong question. How did you, and were you able to find the consistencies amongst the programs to be able to implement?
Well, the thing at the time is I was an open book. I was down for whatever. So the articles that I would gravitate towards were the ones where the title was along the lines of something that I was interested in at that time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether it was I was trying to change the way I was eating, going from ham and cheese sandwiches to legitimate food, or whether it was the X's and O's of programming, because that was something that I didn't really learn besides, you know, at the time in Arnold's book or Muscle and Fitness, you're talking about just periodization, periodization, you know, and that bro split, and that runs out. I didn't reach that point yet, but I even early on knew that was going to run out at some point. So the way I would navigate the content on the page was at that moment, what was on my mind? What did I want to learn about? And I would just sift through. I mean, I would go through pages and pages until I found an article that the title resonated with me.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you go about applying?
Oh yeah, that was the fun part. That's when I would go into the gym the next day. And I didn't have training partners at this time. I was just training solo. I would have a couple people that would come in and be like, hey man, I'm going to start training with you. And even though I didn't know what I was doing, I would train hard, and a lot of people just weren't about it. So I would go into the gym and I'd say, okay, this is what I read last night. My whole workout today is going to be based around what I read last night. And that's how I would do it every day. So I never did anything fully structured. You know, I wasn't on a program. I was just being my own self-experiment.
What were some of the things give me some examples?
Well, I remember the first time you know, it wasn't called the Spoto press back then because Eric Spoto wasn't on the scene.
Yeah.
But it was talking about like half reps. So I was doing these half bench press reps, and one of the other football coaches, he was like the assistant coach. He comes in and he's like, what are you doing half reps for? And I'm like, man, because I read about it last night. There's supposed to be a lot of benefit in this to build your bench press. He was like, we touch our chest in here. And I was like, okay. And I mean, that's one example that I can think of.
Are there any other ones, like things that were still in this phase that you tried that was like, nah, not doing this?
Well, I remember the ones that I had a lot of fun with. I definitely did some ones that after I did it, I was like, okay, let's scrap that. But one was a program by Matt Kroczaleski, and it was just 5x5. Mm-hmm. And this is at the time, I want to say he was on the Muscle and Fitness cover with the like telephone pole or the tree log doing lunges, you know? So I was like, shit, I want to look like that. So if I do this 5x5 program for 12 weeks, going up 5 pounds every week, which you can imagine, I'd been training for a year and it worked. Like I went up to 5 pounds each week, and at the end I put a little bit on my max.
So now we're starting to see a transition into strength.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That was probably the first time that I'd ever really done anything, you know, 5 reps or less. When
did the first powerlifting meet come into play? How far after that?
Well, during that time, obviously I'm reading everything about powerlifting, and I started reading some of Louis' stuff, and I started, you know, following at the time, geared lifting was still pretty big. So I was really getting into that. And of course, you know, I'm rolling around in Elite FTS and Westside barbell shirts and stuff like that. And, there was this older guy that came in the gym just randomly. And the gym where I trained was a YMCA in small town, and it had 1 bench press, 1 squat rack. It didn't even have a deadlift area. We got yelled at so much because we deadlifted in front of the dumbbell rack. Mm-hmm. And nobody came in there who was a legit power lifter. And this bowling ball looking dude, probably like, I forget how old Dan was at the time, Dan Hernandez, he's from Washington State. And he had just moved there, and he's got a Westside barbell shirt on, and he's incline benching. And he had 405 on the bar. You got to understand, nobody's ever inclined 405. I don't even think anybody had flat bench 405. And he unracks it, and you know, he's making all the noises like the, and he unracks it, and he's like going down so slow. and it touches his chest, and he almost threw it through the ceiling. It was the first time I'd ever seen power in lifting, because everything up to that point had been like control. And I go over to him and I was like, dude, that was the most impressive thing I've ever seen. And he sees my West Side shirt, right? He's like, oh, you know about West Side Barbell? And I was like, oh yeah, you know. Like, and he goes, be here tomorrow at 4:30. And I was like, okay. And I showed up, and the first day he puts me in a katana single ply shirt, and we were doing reverse band against two board. And I'd never even seen any of that. And I'm in a bench shirt. At the time, my max was, I think, like 245. And he had me work up to 405 that day. And you know how that feels on your body. I was wrecked for a week. I like got a cold and stuff and felt like I had the flu.
Did you do anything after that movement?
No, I think we might have done like dumbbell press and went home, because it took 2 hours. That was also my first time with extended workouts, because normally they were like 90 minutes. And after that day, after I got through that initial feeling of like, what the fuck did I just do? I was like, this is it. It was the first thing that related to everything else that I had done in my life.
How so?
Because everything I had done, the things that I loved doing that weren't weight training, I loved the power of it. Like swinging an axe, swinging a sledgehammer, hitting a baseball, striking somebody out, legging out a double. All of those things are power. And that was the first thing that I had ever really experienced that resembled that. And that's when I was like, this is my missing link right here.
Dave Tate here from elitefts to talk to you about bands. We've been a supplier of bands for almost 2 decades now. So I've known my way around the band landscape. When I'm talking about bands, I'm talking about floss bands, long bands, short bands, bands you can use for resistance training, mobility training, body weight training, and flossing. One of our most popular bands, or actually our most popular bands, are the long bands. The long bands are typically used the most with squats, bench presses. Our floss bands are bands that you wrap around the joint to be able to help with mobility, circulation. And the short bands are designed for shorter range movements, bench press, deadlifts, and a lot of times people will use them with resistance machines to help accommodate the strength resistance curve. Head over to elitefts.com and look for bands in the toolbar or blowout menu.
So where'd your training go from there?
We trained with him. So it was pretty much a butchered conjugate.
So like a follow the leader thing. So whatever he was doing. Now, was it all 3 lifts? Okay. And did that lead into your first meet?
Ultimately, yeah.
And was that in gear or not in gear?
No, that was raw. So that was in knee sleeves.
Okay. So how did that training evolve? Because obviously he's in gear. Was he raw? I mean, what was the shirt
he was single ply.
All right. So how was that training modified, if at all, for you because you were raw?
So what we would do is, I never got in briefs. I never got in a squat suit. My other training partner at the time, so there were 3 of us. So Dan and Tyler were in single ply. And I was like, man, I'll train in a bench shirt because that's what you had me do. But I'm really going to do everything raw. So what he ultimately ended up doing, I did some work in a bench shirt, but then he would put me in a slingshot this is when slingshot first came out. So it was like the blue one. So I would just do my raw work that I was like, hey, Dan, I think this is what I'm going to do today for my raw work. And then after that, he would put me in a slingshot and I would do some overload work. But everything else, my other lifts were all raw.
Okay.
And he kind of gave me, he wasn't strict. Like he didn't say, hey, you got to do what I'm doing. It was like, hey, well, this is what we're doing. And he would give me recommendations on what weights to go with each set, but he would let me do whatever movement that I wanted to do, whatever variation.
Were you all training for the same meet at the same time?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So he's basically, I get what's going on. So he's basically periodizing it for you, going into that meet, but keeping it as close to what everybody else is doing, which is like compromise training.
Yeah, exactly.
Was it or was it not, right? Because sometimes you'll have a crew like that and it will be what I would call compromised training. Other times you're just doing what the strongest guy does because that's what he just says everybody's going to do. And it's like default how it works. Was it sounds like it was more compromised.
Yeah. There would be some days when, and he was never like super hard on me, you know? He wanted me to learn. And he wanted to teach me because he knew that that's what I loved the most about it. But if he saw that I was maybe like slacking a little bit, he would say, all right, man, today we're going to put 225 on the bar for squats and you're going to squat it for as many reps as possible. And I was like, what? That's like, that goes against everything that we're trying to do right now. He'd be like, let's do it. So we did that. I think at the time I got like 37 reps or something. And then I'm thinking we're done. And he's like, let's go on to leg extensions. And we did the same thing with leg extensions, you know, couple sets to absolute failure. And looking back, he wasn't trying to teach me a lesson. I think he just wanted me to experience like what pushing yourself, you know, outside of your comfort zone and to those limits was all about.
How many years of powerlifting do you think he had up until that point himself?
I'm pretty sure he started lifting in the 80s.
All right.
Competing in the 80s.
He may not know he was doing this, but kind of what he's indirectly doing is anchoring effort. You know, so if you got to push something like that hard, and then he tells you, you know, say that's, as we would call it now, RPE, whatever you would say, the effort RPE is 10, but then on this other movement, he can say, look, just push this, you know, not moderately hard, but now you know what the actual really hard is.
That's right.
Right. So it's a way to anchor effort where intensity is different because it's a max, right? It's a percentage of a max, where it's interesting that all these things are kind of falling, you know, into place. So how did the first meet go?
I walked in pretty much modified plan. And the only thing I knew about how to prepare for a powerlifting competition was through articles. And I read one article and I forget who it was by at the time, maybe Brandon or something. And he was like, first meet, try to go 9 for 9. And I was like, okay, well, I'll try to go 9 for 9, but these are the numbers that I want to hit. So that whole time I had this note card with my goals, squat, bench, and deadlift. And I had it by my light switch in my room, just taped on the wall. And that's pretty much all I thought about. And then what I did was kind of just work backwards and say, okay, well, this is how many weeks out I am. This is, if I want to give myself a chance to hit these numbers, this is kind of what I got to work up towards before I go to this competition. And I went there and hit those exact numbers. And it's crazy because they were actually pretty close to what at the time I felt like I was capable of. Now, you don't really know if that's true or not because I was just starting to experience what, you know, maximal effort was. So who knows if at the meet I was actually holding back or, you know, obviously at that point you can't tap into everything quite yet when you've only been training for 2 to 3 years. But I pretty much hit everything spot on, had a perfect day, 9 for 9.
So what was the meet?
It was a RPS Powerpalooza. RPS Powerpalooza.
This is in a gym, a hotel?
This is in a hotel. Right. This was one of Gene Richlack's meets.
Okay.
And it was in like the Holiday Inn.
So what are you thinking when you just walk in to begin with?
I saw mutants in there. Like,
yeah, I mean, so you go in to weigh in the day before, right?
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
Well, I kind of knew that's what to expect. I didn't cut weight or anything. I just wanted to go lift. So I walk on the scale. I think I forget what I weighed in at, but.
Had you gone to a meet before this at all?
I went to one meet. Yeah.
Okay.
So
so there's some experience.
Yeah. One of my friends at the time, Jeff Calloway, was doing a meet and over in Baltimore. So I rode out there with a couple friends and we watched him compete. He showed up without a singlet. Like he didn't have an idea what to do. So they give him this like bright yellow singlet, like the yellow of that box over there. And we watched the whole thing and we're like, dude, that's pretty cool. So I had an idea about the flow of the day that you got to weigh in. It was a USAPL meet. So he weighed in 2 hours before. So the whole day before the 24-hour weigh-ins, I was like, well, that's cool. that means I can go relax and eat and stuff like that. But when you go to weigh in, you're only seeing a few people who are going to be competing the next day. And when you walk into the gym or into the ballroom where it was, and at the time, people, geared lifting was still very, very popular. And, I mean, there were some guys who were team elite FTS that were there competing, and, they're squatting 700, 800, 900 pounds. And I was like, what have I just gotten into? I thought that's how the whole thing was going to be.
Yeah.
And then we go through the day, and I'm meeting people that are in my weight class and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, you're a normal dude like I am. Well, this is cool. And at the time, there weren't really females who competed. So there might've been one female. And, but you got guys like me who it was my first meet. And then you got guys who have been doing it for 20 years who are, multiply lifters. And then you got Gene at the time. I didn't know who Gene was. Somebody was like, yeah, Gene is benched and squatted 1,000. And I couldn't comprehend it, so that was my first experience with a meet.
So you had people handling you?
No.
Okay. This is going to get better. All right. So how do you know when to warm up?
Yeah.
And just walk me through this.
Yeah. So I did have, Dan and Tyler, my two training partners, Dan's the older guy, Tyler was about my age. They were competing on the second day, because Saturday was the weight classes up to like 220 or 198. And then the next day is everybody else. So they were kind of like, hey man, and they weren't handling me, but they were guiding me. Okay. They were like, hey, you should go warm up, because you're going to be on the platform like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And I haven't even like touched a bar yet, so you're also asking everybody else questions. This is something this is a whole nother topic, but when you go to meets these days, people aren't really talking to each other. Like when you're getting in the mono or when you're getting on squat racks, everybody wants to be on their own rack. So it's like, at the time I was used to 6 guys warming up on a mono, and then 2 people, running the mono, one on each side. And they're like, you're up. What are you taking? You're up. What are you taking? What's your rack height? So I'm just going with the flow, and I'm watching these guys, and they're jumping up these certain amounts. So I'm just collecting all that data and just applying it the best I can.
Yeah. So you don't see that now?
Not as much. And it's kind of a federation thing. This is a whole other rabbit hole, but to this day, if you go to like a RPS meet or something like that, they usually have 2 monos, and you got to warm up on those 2 monos. And if there are 12 people in your flight, well, you're going to have 6 on this rack, 6 on the other. Now, a lot of the like USPA meets that I've been to, or USAPL meets, whatever, they use combo racks. It's very easy to stack a bunch of combo racks in a trailer and take it wherever you need to go. So you got 4 or 5 combo racks. And then, if you got 10 people in a flight, you got 2 people warming up on each one, which is kind of nice because you don't have to deal with people. But part of what I learned and part of the competitiveness is from warming up with the people who you're competing against. And when I was warming up from those very early meets, I'm like, this son of a bitch is in my weight class and he's warming up with this weight. I'm trying to beat him, And I think there's something to be said about that, the warm up room itself.
Yeah. So after that meet was over, were you sold?
Oh, dude, it was all I cared about. I mean, that was it. It was stopped hanging out with some of the people I was hanging out with. It was, hey mom, I'm missing dinner tonight because I'm going to train. It was traveling to different places to train that we had never been before, just because we wanted to get out of our gym. And also at the time we realized it was going to help us with the competitions, going to a new place, new equipment. So I was 100% all in.
How did this correlate with you going back to school timeline wise?
So the first meet overlapped when I decided to go back to school. So before my meet, before I had gotten into powerlifting, I had a couple people that would come and go training with me. And I realized doing that, I was like, man, I love training. I love pushing myself to the limit, but I love helping these people because I love when they come in the next day and they're like, hey man, I'm feeling great, or my weight's changing, or I'm putting on muscle, or, such and such said I look good. And because I was that same person. So I was like, that's where it's at. That's awesome. And that's where I gravitated towards. So I was talking to my sister one day. My sister was 30 years old, single parent, and she had just gone back to school to be a nurse. She was taking night classes, working multiple jobs and everything. And it was very hard for her. And she was like, Curtis, I can tell you want to do this. I can tell you love it. Make sure you don't wait until maybe you end up in a tough spot like I am. And it's very hard to go back to school. If you're thinking about it, do it now. So that's when I went back to school. And then while I was at Salisbury in college, that's when I was preparing for this first competition.
When you were college, how close was that to your home?
It was only an hour.
All right. So you were still living at home to be able to go to college, or?
I was living on campus.
On campus?
Yeah.
So now you're in this whole different campus life. So you got to find a different place to train.
Yeah.
So what did that look like?
Luckily they had multiple buildings that were training facilities. They had one for the athletes, and then they had two separate ones that were for the students. So I didn't have to leave campus. And to be honest, there wasn't anything down there at the time aside from the campus gyms. And so I could, where I was staying, the apartment complex that I was staying at, if I walked through the woods over the train tracks, I would be at the gym. Okay. It was pretty easy.
All right. So are you working during this time as well?
It's during breaks. So during summer break, winter break, I was working at the YMCA. I was working front desk and basically doing I was doing consultations at the time. And I had just gotten my basic personal training certification. So like a weekend course, I went like 6 weekends and got my WITS, World Instructor Training Schools, got my WITS certification, I had like 1 or 2 clients at the YMCA, but then I was also working as a physical therapy tech at the local PT clinic. So, that was what my summers and winter breaks consisted of.
All right. Were you in a situation to where any extra revenue that you needed while you were in school had to be made during those time periods?
Yeah.
So
for sure.
It was important.
It was very important.
For that. What training environment were you able to find other people that were training for meets?
There was one guy. Initially, there was one guy, and he ran the gym on campus. His name was Eric Price, and Eric saw me lifting one day. And he was like, hey man, what do you compete, something? And I was like, I'm training for my first meet. And so every day I would walk into the gym, I would stop into his office and he and I would talk. And, we would go over, training philosophies, concepts, exercise selection, all of that. And then shortly after that is when I met Mike Hedleski and Andy Deck, because they were training there as well. And that was a huge shift. Because Mike and Mike's sense of humor. I thought the guy hated me for like a year. And then he'd be like, hey man, that was fucking good. Like, you should try this. And he would give me just little things to try and to implement. So between Eric Price, Mike Hedleski, and then, reading and watching videos on Andy, being part of Elite FTS, that was like pretty much all I had.
Yeah. All right, guys, we're back. During the bathroom break, I went in my office and saw that Mike Israetel sent some Genius shots. So I've never tried these. They're not a sponsor, or maybe they will be. I don't know. So we're going to give an honest opinion because neither one of us have ever tried this before. So there's a blue raspberry and there's whatever this one is, orange cream. And it's 23 grams of protein in the shot.
You got the orange. Let me get the blue raspberry.
All right. So here goes.
it doesn't taste like ass. This is kind of a great idea because
it's easy.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Mike.
I can drink that.
Oh, that's not bad.
No,
and it's easy.
Oh, that's good.
This is a good deal, man. This is 23 grams of protein.
Yeah.
Down right there. Done.
The only downfall I could see is if you want something that's going to fill you up a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if it's like late night before bed,
yeah,
you're probably going to make an actual protein shake. But if you just are trying to get in your protein, man, that's where it's at.
Yeah. I mean, post training or
exactly.
I don't eat a whole lot like I used to.
Right.
We'll get into that. But that's a way to cap off.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I have a meal that's like 30 grams of protein, but I got to pump it up a little bit.
Right.
It's not bad. It's actually, it's good.
Yeah.
You know, it's better than I expected.
Isn't it crazy how stuff has changed over the years?
Well, anytime I see anything that's in a little shot, you know what I'm thinking? We're thinking that gas station shit.
Yeah.
You know, the energy drinks,
Right.
which are just nasty as hell. Yeah. There was some ketone stuff that somebody sent one time. That was the worst tasting shit I've ever had in my entire life. It was terrible.
Right.
Good job, Mike.
Yeah.
All right. I want to get back to this educational route because you just threw out Andy Deck and Mike Holinsky, which both have been on the podcast. And you're reading all the information on Elite FTS and you're in college. And I went to college for exercise science / nutrition. And it didn't necessarily correlate very well with what I saw being applied that worked. You're at a different time frame with that. So, and you mentioned that, was it one of your professors that you were speaking to or the person that about different training methodologies? So how was what you were learning outside of college correlating with what you're learning in college?
So when I was in college, all the way up until I graduated, I had this idea that I was going to be a Division I strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah, we all do.
Yeah, right. And then, so Matt Nine, who was the head strength and conditioning coach there, I think he's still there, but he goes around the room one day when we start our internship and he's like, I want everybody to tell me what you want to do. Everybody's like, I want to be the Alabama football strength and conditioning coach. And I told him what I wanted to do. And he was like, just so you guys know, it's not impossible, but it would be one of the hardest things you've ever done. So don't limit yourself to that because there's different avenues.
Yeah. Now, did he explain to you what that really meant though?
He did.
Okay.
Yeah. He definitely did. And Mac, he worked his butt off there.
Yeah.
He would open the main sports facility first thing in the morning. He would run a lot of the programs. He was in charge of every sport. There was one head strength coach at Salisbury University and it was him. And I didn't necessarily agree with how he wanted everybody to be trained, all the teams, but he gave the GAs a lot of freedom on how they wanted to train the teams. And so, you know, that was cool, but he did a really good job of letting us know how hard it is.
Well, at the same, how many sports? I mean, because he may have 300 athletes.
I don't remember. I don't even want to put a number on it.
Well, that's where it can get really
it's a D3
dicey.
school.
That's where it can get dicey though, as a strength coach. And it's really the only one is there's hundreds of athletes that they're responsible for, which is a huge, it's a different world, but he was up front and honest enough for you to see the hours that it really takes.
And he told me one time, like how many hours he works a week just to do what he was doing.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh shit, is this the path I really want to go down? And at the time, powerlifting, I didn't think that I could make a living around the sport of powerlifting. So I thought that, you know, personal training or being in a private sector where I could actually do a lot of one-on-one stuff, because during my time as a intern there, I saw the chaos. And on my first day of the internship, I was in charge of one squat rack. And I had on that same squat rack 4 guys, and this is at 6 a.m. Monday morning. I had the senior quarterback, and then I had a freshman wide receiver. And senior quarterback is squatting very, very well. And at the time, you know, I had already done a couple competitions. I had a good understanding of how we want to squat. And then the freshman wide receiver comes up. I don't know what school he came from. I didn't know his background, but he's squatting in 1 plates, 2 plates, you know, 2.5 plates, and he's on his toes. His heels are legitimately coming off the ground. So my limited... I assume
he's wearing running shoes.
He was wearing running shoes, like Nike, you know. And I say, hey man, you're on your toes a little bit. What I want you to do on the next one is I want you to sit back a little bit. And I knew what that meant. And this is the moment that changed my coaching direction as far as cueing. He said, sit back. I'm like, yeah, just sit back. Keep your heels flat. So he goes up to 3 plates, and he walks out and he goes to squat, and he falls back on me. Like legitimately, he went to sit back so far, he fell on me. And we're both laying on the ground. I go, man, what the hell are you doing? And he goes, you told me to sit back. And that right there was the moment that I was like, this wasn't his fault.
Yeah.
You know, like he didn't know what that meant, but he was trusting me. Now, most people...
Interesting though, because a player, even at that division, playing at that next level, is a coachable athlete. So he's doing exactly what you told him to do.
He sure is. So yeah. And that was the day that I was like, I don't know if the collegiate strength and conditioning field is where I see myself, because all I wanted to do after that was take him after the training session and just go over technique with him. And I was like, I can't do that in this profession. And that's when I started gravitating more toward kind of the private sector one-on-one training sessions.
Yes. How did the coursework that you're doing help build the foundation for when you started personal training more formally?
I think it really clicked when I was taking classes like kinesiology, exercise physiology. My ex-phys instructor, Dr. Scott Mazzetti, he was actually friends with Matt Wenning at Ball State. And this is at the time when Matt was driving back and forth to Westside. And each weekend he said that Matt would come back from training out the Westside and be like, hey, Scott, this is what we were doing today. We were messing with these bands, and we were messing with these chains and all this stuff. So first day of exercise physiology class, Scott Mazzetti's in there, and I didn't know anybody else that was competing in powerlifting in my class. Everybody else kind of wanted to be like a personal trainer. So I had trouble relating to everybody because I was taking it very serious, and I was I don't want to say the only one, but I was trying to apply the things that I was learning in class about the human body to my training. And I don't know how many other people were doing that. And I remember Mazzetti, he goes, anybody here, we were talking about squatting. He goes, anybody here know the name Matt Wenning? I was like, yeah. I was the only person that raised my hand in a class of 60 people. He goes, see me after class. So we go, I go up to the front of the room, and we're talking about he and Matt and talking about powerlifting. And then it seemed like every single day in class, Scott would ask me a question about training. If what we were learning, the physiology aspects were related to actual training, he would ask me my opinion, which was crazy.
Yeah.
You know, so that's at the point, I think, when I really started studying under him, is when I was like, okay, I can add this stuff right here that I've accumulated, this knowledge that I've accumulated up to this point, all the textbooks I've read, I can actually apply them to what I'm doing and my understanding about how I can get better.
All right. So the reason I ask is when I went through, when I go and look back, all it really provided me from an application standpoint was a bullshit detector.
Yeah.
Right? It's because of the coursework that I had. It's pretty easy, you know, to know what's bullshit and what's not. But it didn't really provide any, because I'm sitting there and I don't want to, personal training was the last thing from my mind. I'm a gym manager, helping people in the gym and stuff like that. So everything that I was learning was just for one reason, to be a better lifter myself.
Right.
You know, so I'm sitting there listening, like maybe I can use that. Maybe that's bullshit. You know, and just kind of picking apart that way. But there wasn't a whole lot, you know, and actually there was a bunch that was really counter, you know, and I'm like, I'm just going to keep my fucking mouth shut. And
exactly.
So it sounds like there was a good blend.
There was,
you know, because and you may even get asked this question now is, you know, is a college degree worth it? Because now you're dealing with a higher scale, you're dealing with a larger cost, all these other things. And my answer is actually no at this point, but there's a huge caveat with that, because the bullshit detector is super important, because it's a whack industry, but all industries are whack. The caveat is, when I say something like that, it's kind of giving people permission to not take the time to learn, you know, and the outside learning that you did compared to the learning in college is probably tenfold.
Yep.
What's in there. So if you're going to remove college, that probably needs to be 20-fold,
right? Because
you're still going to have to learn the basics,
yep,
you know, of kinesiology, exercise physiology, all those things. You need to at least have some basic understanding of that to find the correlations amongst all the different programming that's out there and all the biases and all that. There are correlations in there. And I don't think most people are going to do that.
You're right.
You know, so I talk in circles to where then it goes back to the degree would probably help.
Yeah.
You know, because you're also in a sheltered environment for 4 years, you know, which you were a little bit later. So you're maybe somewhat a little more mature, you know, because of that. But when you can be in a sheltered environment 4 years after you're out of school, that could help you to not do really stupid shit. You know, that provides a benefit in itself there as well. So how do you answer that question? Because you just saw me counter my own self.
Yeah. Well, it's not black or white. It's a depends kind of thing. I will say getting the degree gave me a little bit of recognition for the jobs that I was going after, because the first really good personal training job that I got, you had to have an exercise physiology 4-year degree.
Yeah.
So that got my foot in the door. And then they heard I had a CSCS, and they were like, well, shit, we're going to start you out at a little higher rate too. And it was a salaried position. So with opportunity for bonuses, which it ended up not working out great because of how many people I was training, but it got me better recognition with the jobs that I had.
That's a good point, because I wouldn't have gotten my fitness instructor, my first personal training gig, had I not had the degree. But I also I already had the CSCS, but I had to have ACSM as well, which I hated. Whatever. That
was like the most basic of the basic stuff.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But I also, for me, going back to college it forced me to slow down and really learn as much as I could over the broad spectrum. So yes, it took a long time to pay off loans, and I wish I could have done it without that. But during those 4 years, I made connections. I met people who I could learn other things from. It forced me to sit down and really study these textbooks, which I probably wouldn't have read textbooks. I would have read other training books. So it broadened my base and my knowledge, and forced me to slow down and take everything in. And without getting my degree in that, I don't know how it would have ended up. So in some ways it's not worth it. Some ways it is. I think it depends on what you're looking for and how involved you really want to get into this profession.
Well, if we just look at this discussion, if you look at the gaps, not really, the gaps that would be there if you didn't go, the credibility, you know, to be hired, right? So the people may be thinking, well, I don't want to do those jobs. You know, I just want to do it on my own. Okay. Good luck with that.
Yeah, right.
You know, but So that's the first question they need to ask, because they're probably not going to get hired.
Right.
You know, as a fitness instructor or personal trainer under most places, just from a liability standpoint, you know, they have to have some credentials with that.
Right.
They have to have the ability to be able to read dense material, textbooks, you know, research, maybe, but textbooks certainly, you know, to be able to find that and to take the time to actually digest it. If they can fill those 3 gaps, then I would say probably not necessary.
Right.
You know, as long as they're willing to put the time in,
Yeah.
you know, to be able to learn. But that's just at the intellectual level. There's a whole other level, which is, to me, is more important. And that's the application, the hands-on, the actually doing it part, which, did you get any of that in college through the course? There's the internship, right? So kinda.
We had one course that was called like exercise application or fitness application or something like that. We would go into the weight room and the instructor would go over, you know, sets, reps, weights, you know, how to adjust the equipment, how to train a client one-on-one if you're working with somebody, things like that. But those were things that I had already been doing for years, you know? So as far as kind of circling back a little bit, if I always knew that I wanted to be a powerlifting coach, which that's not all that I am, but that's the main population I work with now, I wouldn't have needed to go to college. I mean, how many powerlifting coaches do you know that never went to college? Probably more than not. But I think going to college, you know, understanding the ins and outs, how to apply that to one-on-one personal training sessions across the board with different demographics of people, those skills that I acquired have helped me be a better powerlifting coach. Because you know as well as I do that when it's one-on-one, you're not just giving people a program. If you're a legit coach, I'm dealing with family issues, you know, that people are experiencing, you know, jobs, sleep schedules. You're doing a lot of psychology, and those are things that I learned about in college.
So let's dive into that, because we're going to jump forward a little bit. So you get hired, you know, at Union Fitness to be basically the personal training, and you are now working with demographics that are the whole spectrum, you know, of people. And so, because now being online, there's some attributes that are lost, you know, with that. And what I don't know, because I've not lived that life, you've lived this life, so you'll know, is those attributes when you're working with somebody in person, you know, which I did have, you know, 10, 12 years doing that. There's a lot of corrections, a lot of cueing, you know, a lot of things that can just happen like that. But then that, when you're online, that gets removed. But if you've never had that, do you even know that it's removed? No. You know, so it's a huge blind spot. That's that counter argument that, you know, every online coach should actually have some real in-person coaching experience, where I try to look at things from all perspectives, where I get that, but I'm going to be biased because I did that. Right. You know what I'm saying? Where, you know, so it's a strong bias though. Right. And I'm sure you're going to feel the same way. So when you're at Union Fitness and you're competing now too, so you got a lot of things going on, right? So you have, if you're compartmentalizing things, you got the meathead, you know, that's the competing, just focusing, but then you got to very quickly step away from that to be able to get to the person that's working with, you know, post rehab, you know, somebody that, how do you manage all that? Well,
you know, this is where you really have to have a conversation with yourself and ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing. And my number one goal at the time was always to be the best professional that I could be, and that everything that I do is for the client. So yes, I was competing in powerlifting, but I, aside from wanting to be the best powerlifter that I could, I knew that every time I walked into a training session or every time I stepped on the platform, I was gaining a better understanding about how to continue to progress, how to work around injuries, that I could take something and apply it to my clients, regardless of what their goals were, because they intermingle. So if I was in a training session, there's some trainers or coaches that when they're in a training session, they don't like to talk to people. Well, these people are looking up to me. And if they have a question about what I'm doing while I'm doing it, in my mind, I'm on the clock. And that gave me a better understanding about like, hey, I can turn it off and on. Because if a potential client walks up to me, I mean, it's putting food on my table. If a potential client walks up to me and they're like, hey man, I see you're doing this when you're deadlifting and you have 700 pounds on the bar, tell me about that. I would take a couple minutes and I would just do a brief summary about what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. And I would say 50% of the time that led to a client. Mm-hmm. So that was always my number one priority. And I would find time to train. That wasn't hard for me. Like I used to drive an hour each way after training 12 clients in a row, 1 hour sessions. And I would drive an hour to go to the closest gym. It wasn't a powerlifting gym. It was a CrossFit gym, but they had a deadlift platform and a monolift. Actually, Mike Hedleski's monolift was in there. So I could turn it on and off. That wasn't a problem. But I just always reminded myself like why I'm doing this and who I'm serving.
So were you training clients before Union Fitness?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That was mainly, so when I moved to Pittsburgh, Casey asked me to be his director of training.
The head of that.
Yep.
Okay.
So I didn't, I had a few clients at Union Fitness, but for the most part, it was overseeing personal training.
Okay.
And all of the trainers.
All right. What you just said interests me because were you able to train in the same place that you work? Right? Because you said that hour drive, and I get that, because even training in my own place, if I had to train in the evening, I would go drive somewhere and then come back to re-enter, differently. Yep. And when I was a trainer, there's maybe like sled pulls and shit, like stupid machine accessory shit. Yep. Did you find that same situation?
It was hard.
Yeah.
It was very hard. And so when I was training for a meet, if I was in a meet prep, it didn't matter what day it was. It didn't matter what my schedule was. I was taking that hour drive. Mm-hmm. And, my wife and I, we were just dating at the time. And some days she would go down with me. Other days she couldn't. And legitimately the only time we saw each other was in the morning. Cause when I got home at 10 o'clock at night, she was in bed. Mm-hmm. But on days where maybe it was just like very light accessory work, or if I had a cancellation and I had like a gap, like a 1 hour gap open up, it was like, do I eat or do I train? Well, you train as fast as you can and then hope to leave 5 minutes to not choke on your food.
What's interesting, because I experienced the same thing, is the thing that we were trying to avoid by deciding to not be the strength coach is the exact thing that we ran into.
You're exactly right.
Right. And it's so crazy to not have had the foresight to think this through. Yeah. Like if you need X number of billable hours, what's that's going to be? Mm-hmm. How long is that going to be? Where's the training going to be? And it's like, oh shit. Yeah. Because if you're getting paid per client, then you're not getting paid for the gap, of a cancellation or whatever it's going to be. So, 40 billable hours in a week is like 50 hours in the gym.
Yes.
So.
Well, it was funny because years ago, I was writing articles for Team Builder, the Team Builder app. And one of the articles I wrote was about, why you should or should not get into this profession. And when you're in college, I knew I was going to be busy as a personal trainer, and it takes away from your time focusing on yourself. But a lot of the people that I was talking to, I'm like, hey, why are you getting in this profession? Oh, cause I love to work out. And even early on, I was like, that's not a good reason, because it's the opposite. And this article I wrote for Team Builder years ago was talking about that. And it was like, if you want to get in this profession because you like working out and you like training, that ain't it, because you're not going to have time to do it. I mean, how many professional personal trainers or coaches do you see that have to sacrifice, or they just choose not to train, and which is something that's completely wrong with the profession in itself. But that's what I always made it mandatory. I didn't give two shits what I had going on. I worked my whole day and I trained. It didn't matter what time of night it was. I was training because I knew it was making me better in all aspects. And I could apply that obviously to myself for my competitions, but for my clients.
It was the same thing people do that work in other professions.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Think about that.
Yep.
Right. So I get why a lot of strength coaches get in that position, right? Like, I get that. But at the same time, there are, like I just said, there are people that work in different professions that still get it done.
Right.
And work as many or sometimes more hours.
Oh, yeah.
To be able to do it, doing a job that they may not necessarily even like in the first place.
Exactly.
So what do you think was the most pivotal turning point? Not turning point, but what in your powerlifting career, what point created the greatest upward mobility? Oh,
you're going to be able to relate to this one. It was the 2017 Arnold XPC finals. At the time, I was following you guys all the time. And a couple years before, I saw that Casey and Brandon just became team athletes. So I was following them. And then, my wife is from Pittsburgh. So we would travel back and forth. And the first time I ever went up to Pittsburgh is when Union Fitness first opened. And it was in the fall of 2016. And I saw that Casey was signed up for the XPC finals. So I started following Union Fitness on Instagram, I had been following Casey, and I was like, dude, we're going to go up and train there around Christmas. And we went up there, and it was like the day after Christmas, so they were closed. So we actually went and trained at Ryan Selly's gym, which was awesome. I met Ryan and we talked and stuff like that. But then we go to the XPC finals, and I tried this stupid weight cut, and I didn't do it right. And I had a really shitty day. And I remember walking back in the warm-up room, and I had known that Casey was experiencing like his first major ulcerative colitis flare-up. And you were back there, and you basically told him not to compete. And I saw him in the corner, and he was like, man, he looked miserable. And he had like a piece of bread, and he was like spreading some peanut butter on it. And I was like, I'm not going to bother this guy. But I walk up to him, and I was like, hey man, it's really nice to meet you. He asked me what my name was, and I told him that, my wife is from Pittsburgh and I'd like to come train with him. He was like, dude, you need anything at all, you let me know. And throughout that time, is when he started really going downhill. And then he started getting better, and he started taking on clients. And it was one night we were laying in bed, and I'm scrolling through Instagram, and Casey put up a post, and it says something like, hey, accepting clients, DM me if you're interested. And I couldn't sleep that night. And I wait, like I nudge her. It's like, we're both falling asleep, and I nudge her, and I'm like, hey, something tells me I should work with Casey. And she was like, yeah, I know. Like she already knew the answer. And the next day I messaged him, and he started coaching me. And it was yet another reason to make those trips to Pittsburgh. And we're talking 6-hour drives, and we did it like every month almost. And that was the turning point where I told her, like, I want you to know, this is what I'm focused on right now. I don't know how long I'm going to do this. I'd like to say I want to do it for a long time, but in these next coming years, with Casey's guidance, with going up there and training, I want to be the absolute best that I can be.
Was there anything on that first trip that you remember?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was one of the things because he had been coaching me for a few months. And one of the things was trying to get myself packed back into the bar. and mainly on the descent of the squat. Cause I had been leaning out a little bit. My skinny neck was poked out, and I got there a little bit late. He told me the wrong time in typical Casey fashion. And we show up and everybody was already squat. So I just sat there and I watched everybody. I just took in everything. And, Julia was there. Yessie was there. Jabez and Jody Burford were there, and they're all squatting. And I'm like, dude, this is where it's at. And then afterwards I start squatting, and Casey had me doing tempo work. So I had 405 on the bar for squats, tempo squats, 5-second eccentrics. And I'm going down, and he comes up, and all he does was like poke me in my back. And he's like, hey, pull this in, my lats, pull the bar in. And he poked me. And it was the first time I experienced that. And that was when I realized there's certain things you can only learn in person, but I can figure out how to verbally communicate these things to people online. And that was the first thing where I was like, hey, we got to start coming back up here more frequently, because this is so valuable. It's a 6-hour drive on a Friday night to train and then come back the next day is worth it.
What did you see the difference in your total from when you started doing that to the next meet?
I put 100 and some pounds on my total. I think at the Arnold, I totaled like 1650 at 198. And then working with Casey, my next meet, I totaled 1765.
Now, how much would you attribute that to the program organization?
Yeah.
And how much would you attribute to just locking in better technique?
It was more so, in a way, I didn't want to let him down. So if he put something on the program, I was going to hit it. And I was never going to ask him if I can do something else. Like if I was having an off day, I was doing what was on the program. If I felt like I absolutely needed to make an adjustment because of an injury, I would just do what I thought was best. Aside from that, like I'm doing what this man puts on the program because he's my coach and I'm paying him and I trust him. I 100% buy in. And that was what he told me from the very beginning. He was like, look, you're going to make a lot of progress. We're going to have a lot of fun, but you can't sign up for this. And at the time I didn't have the money to do it, so that's another thing. He said, if you're going to sign up for this, you have to 100% buy in. And I was like, dude, I'm sold. So it was pushing myself harder than I ever had pushed myself up to that point. But it was also the feedback from the technique from him.
When you say pushing yourself harder, how so?
Because
it's not like you're slacking to begin with.
So it was the overall workload and effort of the training sessions. My very first training session I did with him, I was doing 3x5, tempo squats, which I had never done a 5-second eccentric on squat. And then I was doing, heavy leg press. And then I was doing leg extension, leg curls, heavy ab work. And that was more than I'd ever really done at the time. And maybe not necessarily more, but that high of an intensity in relationship to your 1 rep max. Because before that, remember, I was all about Arnold and moving slow and feeling everything. So this was the first time I had ever really had somebody say, if you want to squat 700 pounds, this is what it's going to take. And this is how hard you have to push yourself. In the very first session, it was 7:00 at night is when I started, because I trained 12 clients that day. And my wife, who was just my girlfriend at the time, I text her and I'm like, hey, can you come back in and just be here for support? Because this is one of the toughest training sessions I've done to date. And she stayed there and just helped me the whole training session. And after that was a big mental shift. It was like, okay, you didn't bite off more than you can chew because you're capable of this, but it's going to take as much, if not more, than you thought it was going to take to get to where you're trying to go.
So if I dissect that and we're talking about your accessories, you're now doing them with more force, more compensatory acceleration
yeah,
than what you were before.
yeah. And I'm pushing more things closer, higher up in that RPE scale or closer to failure. You know, it's like one of the things that you two always did was sets of 20 on dumbbell press.
Yeah.
And he was like, hey, we're doing 20s on dumbbell press. And I'm like, okay. You experience, like in your mind, when you're that new, you think 20s, that's going to be light. Well, we're talking, you're taking the hundreds or more to a almost max set of 20 for 2 sets. And you learn how to grind through those reps when your mind is telling you to quit because the burn in the pump is so crazy. Like stuff like that in accessory work. That is, and that's when I realized the benefit of doing that on accessory work, because I was putting on muscle, which I didn't have a ton of it before I worked with him.
What about any technical changes?
Mainly bench press. You know, my deadlift was always a good deadlift. He helped me, you know, get my sternum up and in my shoulder blades down in my back pockets for my deadlift. My squats were good. He taught me how to use my hips in the squat, because being somebody with longer legs, I sat back real far, leaned forward a lot. So he taught me how to strengthen and use my hips, and really the importance of externally rotating and opening up.
How so? When you say, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of it was, this is at the time I was competing in wraps. So he taught me how to use the wraps, right? How to coil the wraps up. And through that, it was about foot placement, what I'm doing with my feet, how I'm twisting them, opening them up to basically really focus on, you know, your external rotators, and then driving out into the floor, spreading the floor. And what I found was I didn't have to sit back as far. I didn't have to lean as far forward. I could keep my sternum up taller. And if I just dialed in my bar position, then I felt extremely more stable than I'd ever been. So coming out of the hole, instead of getting pitched forward, the bar was right over my midfoot, because I'm sitting in my hips, and I could drive my sternum up through the bar. So I went from, you know, instead of, if I were to miss a squat, it would be missing it forward. If I missed a squat, it was because I wasn't strong enough or the weight was too heavy. And that's always the goal, right? That's in my opinion, the mastery of the lift.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest things he taught me.
How did all this lead to you then moving to Pittsburgh?
Yeah. So we had, he put on a meet, and it was called, the Iron City Open. And he held it at the gym, and it was the first ever Iron City Open. And I was coming off of my second meet with him being my coach. And I said, hey man, I think I'm going to do the Iron City Open, but it was in like 6 weeks. And he said, well, normally I wouldn't have somebody do that quick of a turnaround with how many meets you've done in a short amount of time. He was like, but what do you got to lose? You're coming up here. It's people, you know, you got a chance to do really, really well. And, you're coming off of a meet where you did really well. Like, let's just roll right into it. So I, you know, obviously no cut. I did a week where I didn't train at all. And then we just jumped right back into it and did another, 6-week preparation for it. And I came up and I won the whole thing. And I think I totaled like 1876 or something like that. And the thing that I won was Come to Learn to Train, the last Learn to Train seminar that you ever did.
Yeah.
And that was what I won for being the best lifter. And I'm going home that day after the meet. We went out to dinner with the whole crew, Casey, Joe, John, Jabez, Jody, Yessie, everybody. And they're like, man, you keep coming up here, you're going to squat 800 pounds. And I was like, okay. I squatted 700 at the meet, and Casey's like, no, you move up here, you'll squat 800 pounds. And that weekend going home, we were joking. We were like, maybe we should just move up there. And it was a joke. And, I came here about a month or two later and trained here. And then one day I was kind of fed up with how busy my work schedule was, and not fed up with the work schedule, but how clients were just getting randomly kind of added into my schedule. And it was a tough day at work. I come home and I walk in the door. It was like 7:00 at night. And I go, I'm done. Let's move to Pittsburgh. And she's like, when? And I go, screw it up. We can go tomorrow. And a couple months later, we moved up. But at the time, we didn't have jobs. Casey didn't need anybody. Mm-hmm. My wife's a teacher. She didn't have a teaching position at the time. And we were going to move up anyway and just figure it out as we came. Luckily, right before we moved up, Casey asked me to be the director, and then she got a teaching position at a local school, North Allegheny High School.
So then what did that road to 800 look like?
That was a gut check. Because when my first day at Union Fitness, I'm sitting down with Casey, and 99% of the stuff we're talking about is the job. How I can be the best director that I can be. And then we got a little break, and he was like, so what's the next step with competing? And I was like, man, I want to total 2,000. He was like, 2,000, it'll come easy for you. He was like, but anything after that, well, you're going to have to see how big your balls are. And I at the time, I didn't really understand exactly what he meant, mm-hmm. but I learned what he meant. And 2,000 didn't come easy, but it came easier than I thought it was going to because of who I had around me and in my corner. Casey, one of at the time was the 4th best 242 powerlifter of all time. Jabez Burford was a 900-pound raw squatter in sleeves and knee wraps. Jody, his wife at the time, had the all-time world record squat and total at her weight class. And I was training with these people I was squatting with these people every Saturday. So my programming did not change. The programming was almost the same, but what it was, especially Jabez, he taught me how to use a monolift. And I'm not just saying stand up, you know how it is. Mm-hmm. He taught me how to get my hips in the right position, how to get my sternum in the right position, how to squeeze the bar out of the rack instead of just standing up. Because up until that point, every squat I had done was like this. And the limiting factor was my positioning. So he taught me how to get under the bar correctly, get everything down into my lats, tie it into my waist and my hips, squeeze it out of the rack, and then how to keep that throughout the lift. And they were joking because they told me that night at dinner, they were like, you come up here and after a year, you'll squat 800. Well, it wasn't a year because COVID happened. Mm-hmm. It was a year and a half. I put 100 pounds on my squat just from training with these guys, did nothing else different.
Mm-hmm. Then what happened after that?
After that, that's when Casey asked me if I wanted to get into online coaching with him. We were partnering up, and I think I did realize it at the time, but I always wanted to total 2,000 pounds, but I didn't know if I was going to, if that made sense. Mm-hmm. So when I did it, that day that I did it, I squatted 800 that day too. I go home that night and I'm like, well, what's next? You know how it is. What do I do now? And slowly I started transitioning into coaching, powerlifting specific coaching. And it started taking up a little more of my time. I was still training like I normally was, but obviously stress was becoming a little higher because I was taking on a greater workload because I was still the director at Union, but then I was also starting to build my own coaching business on the side. Stress was a little higher, sleep was a little lower, nutrition was suffering, recovery was getting a little less. I still wanted to be better. And I knew that I had more in me, much more in me, because I was just beginning to scratch the surface. But I started getting little nagging injuries just from not doing the things that I needed to do. But I knew that being a coach was ultimately the direction I wanted to go. In those last couple of years, even though I still wanted to be the best powerlifter I could be, I knew that just like when I was a personal trainer, the things I'm doing on the platform are ultimately to help my future as a coach. So that mindset shift started happening. And that's ultimately, the last, I would say 3 meets that I had, were kind of up and down injuries, things like that. That's why you look on open powerlifting and I haven't hit a PR total since 2000. Mm-hmm. I don't even know if I've hit a PR since 2000. And that is when that shift started happening. And I don't think at the time I realized it until later on. I also ruptured my bicep tendon at that time. So coming back from that was a challenge in its own right.
Yeah. How was that? Actually experiencing it and then coming back from it.
Well, how it happened was silly. It wasn't even training related. You know, Todd comes in the gym on a Monday morning. He's like, hey guys, go up to this tractor tire shop and get a couple tires for the gym. So we take my truck up there, and he wanted like a 200-pound one and like a 400-pound one. And they bring the forklift out and they put the tire on the ground. And he's like, whoever the guy was like, you want to try it out? I'm like, yeah, screw it. So I go up there, and if you know anything about flipping tractor tires, it didn't have the curved lugs where you can get your hands underneath. They were very flat side lugs, and I barely squeezed my fingertips underneath. And I knew I shouldn't have done it. And I went to pick it up and I curled it and I ruptured my bicep. And I'm like, well, shit. The guy, my coworker, CJ, who was with me, he thought I ripped my pants because he heard me. So we go back to work. I'm like, Todd, man, I just ruptured my bicep. I worked the rest of the day. Casey calls me. He's like, hey man, why don't you come over? We'll grill some food and drink some whiskey and smoke some cigars. I was like, are you nuts, man? That's the last thing I want to do. I ended over going up Casey's house. We hung out that night. And then luckily he has good connections and they got me in for a surgery pretty quick. But coming off of it was tough because your identity's taken a little bit.
How so?
Because not that you think you're indestructible. You always know that that's a possibility of something like a rupture, like little muscle tweaks, they come and go, but something getting ruptured, and there's different extents, but that's a whole different thing where you realize like, damn dude, this is going to take quite a bit of time to recover from. It's, setting my training back, and you're in a weird mind place because you're losing weight. Your arm, the day you get it out of the cast, it's like shriveled up and it's all small. So from an ego standpoint, it makes you feel more human. And coming back off of that, you kind of just have to, you evaluate where you're at physically and mentally with competing. And I knew I wanted to come back and still push myself, but it was a good opportunity to restart. So when I moved up to Pittsburgh, Casey was no longer coaching me. He told me, he was like, hey, you're up here now. I'm not going to coach you. I'm here to help you. So I didn't have a coach. So from when I totaled 1,800 pounds to 2,000 pounds, I was doing a lot of my own programming with guidance from him. But then I decided to work with Josh Bryant. I was like, if I'm going to do this, one more go round, because I knew coming off of having my bicep reattached, I knew I was getting closer to, my own coaching business. And that was going to be my number one priority. And I was like, if I'm going to do this one more go round, I'm going to get Josh Bryant, because Jay Bez and Joe and some other guys were working with him. And I knew how hard he was going to push me. And I was like, I'm going to do this right. So Josh was working with me. I had my first meet out in Las Vegas, did really, really well. Ended up getting 804 to my knees, couldn't lock it out. But you want to talk about emotional, when I was going through physical therapy, I remember the very first day I was out of my cast, they had me do a hand dynamometer. And like my left hand was like 160. My right hand was like 5. And you're like, fuck, dude. So then a week later, they had me doing curls with a 1 pound dumbbell. You never know how that's going to affect you until you're sitting there curling a 1 pound dumbbell. And that's one of those things where it becomes a little bit emotional. And then you get back into training and you bench press the bar for the first time. And then you deadlift 135 for the first time. And I went to that meet, and it was 14 weeks after I had my bicep reattached. And I bench pressed over 400 pounds, and I got 804 to my knees. And I left that meet and I was like, I could fucking do anything.
Yeah.
I just came back from that in 14 weeks. I'm ready to go. But then after that, it was just little injuries kind of adding up. And
I've always said that post serious injury, ailments, anything somewhat catastrophically health-wise, 135 is about as hard to train for as a PR.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, because you're
scared to death.
Well, it's not that. It's that you have to go through so much mentally, physically, just to get back to a plate on each side.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, quad tendon ruptures, you know, bicep ruptures are a little bit easier, but, you know, pec ruptures and all the other stuff, because there's those retire a lot of people, you know, and getting range of motion back sucks. I mean, there's a lot of steps that happen in there that just suck, you know, and the mental part of it sucks. But once you get to the 135, it's like, okay, we're good now. We're off to the races.
Yeah.
But just, yes, it's rough.
Well, I don't know, you know, like Travis with his double knees and Paul with Paul's double knee, or, you know, like that's insane. But, you know, for me, I think it was when I deadlifted 500 again, I was like, oh, if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. Like if it was going to re-tear, it would have done it. And after I deadlifted 500 for the first time, I was like, load this bitch up. Yeah. You know, let's go.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying what you're watching, make sure to take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe.
All right. So a little bit of a weird question. Looking back through your training and your powerlifting, did you, because you have an education and you've read a lot about periodization, and optimally, I think the best cycles would be quadrennials. Do you think that you were thinking at all in longer term quadrennials, or was it meat to meat?
For myself?
Yeah.
It was meat to meat, honestly. And it was mainly because I don't know if back when you were competing, you guys would know what meets you were doing in a whole year span. I didn't know when my next meets were going to be.
Really?
So it was.
You're right. Because you're in a weird phase.
Yeah.
Right. Because the bigger raw meets were, I get it. They were changing not just federations and directors, but times of the year.
You're right. It seemed like, you know, raw unity was a big turning point in powerlifting. But then when you get into like the US Open that was out in California, and then you get into the American Pro, which was much more recent, those meets were just randomly popping up. It's not like they were planned years at a time, or years ahead of time. So for me, I mean, I remember laying in bed at night on Instagram, and it's like American Pro, it's about to be the biggest meet in history. I'm like, well, shit, does that fit my, where I'm at right now with work and training? And I'm like, yeah, let me sign up for it. So that's kind of how I went from meet to meet. So that kind of dictated what my approach was with training.
Yeah, that makes sense, because when I was competing, it was typically fall and early spring, and
every year,
so you kind of knew this is where it was going to fall within 6-8 weeks, right? Enough to be able to plan, kind of where everything sat. But you're right. One thing they should at least do is to try to be consistent with when those are going to be able to lay that out, because when you're working with your clients, it's kind of a segue into that. You have to, it's a double-edged sword, because you have to keep the client. Yeah. Right. I mean, that's the first rule. First rule of business is stay in business, but at the same time, you got to be able to project, where they'll be, but you can't program out a whole quadrennial, because you may have them for 2 months, 6 months, a year. Exactly. Lifetime value is going to be different, and there'll be an average on there, but I'm going to guarantee it's probably not 4 years. Right. Right. Yeah. So with that being year to year, then how do you take that? How do you, if somebody's contacting you as a client and you're working with them and you have your vetting process and all that, and it's a good fit and everything's going to be solid, how do you mentally process the duration and how to come up with how to meet their goals with where you think the goals should be?
Sure. Well, the first thing is, and there's a lot of times the people who I start working with don't have a meet picked out. They just say, hey, I want to coach. I think you would be a great fit. I don't have a meet right now, but I want to work towards a meet. So I train them starting as if they could jump into a meet at any point. So as we're preparing, if they say, hey, there's this meet in 8 weeks, do you think I'd be prepared? Or, everything I've heard or read says I need X amount of time. And I'm like, no, you're ready. Let's do it, because this is going to give us more data to bring back into training. So I've actually had a lot of clients who I've kind of had compete more frequently, because I think now, how many meets did you guys used to do a year? You said 2? And some guys, you probably, back when you were doing states, regionals,
when I was younger, I was doing 4.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I think times are a little different. And now everything you see is like, prepare for 1 meet a year. Like, put all your eggs in one basket. Well, a lot of the clients who I work with are beginner or intermediate.
That's filtering down to beginner and intermediate?
Oh yeah, because it's what you see on social media.
Because I could see that for you personally.
Right, yeah.
Right? Because you're at a higher level.
Yeah.
But no, that should not be.
No, not at all. So a lot of people who I start working with, it's not convincing, but explain to them the benefits of competing more frequently. Hey, let's compete 3 times a year. Let's compete 4 times a year. Because that's going to give us, you're going to learn more on the platform than we will in the gym, because that's going to be the meet prep, and being on the platform, the meet is the data that we're going to collect to bring back into training.
Well, not only that, it's the meet experience itself.
The meet experience. You can't prepare for that in the gym. Yeah. So a majority of people who I work with, that's how we kind of approach.
So where would you say, and it's a weird question to ask, so I've been working on trying to find a different way to ask it, but I haven't figured it out yet. Where would you say your training philosophy lies? And everybody's different. I get that, but everybody's going to have a certain bias, philosophy that will bend and twist based upon who the individual is.
That's exactly right.
Right. So how would you explain what your philosophy is?
Well, to boil it down, the biggest thing I try to find is how to keep them progressing, like regardless, in one form or another. Because you got to understand, like, I train people who are firefighters, who are people who work on oil rigs. What's your philosophy when somebody averages 3 hours of sleep a night? It's okay. We program for this week based on how they're feeling and what they can apply to their training session. Some people I have are natural athletes, and I can do, I'll do a conjugate approach with them. Some people are so basic that I am applying linear periodization to them. And it's really just how do I continue progressive overload with each person based off of their experience and where they're at and what their background is.
For how long, right? Because the progressive overload, if it's a 5x5 and so forth, it's only going to go for so long, right? Conjugate's a little bit different beast because there's variables to control a different way. So 8 weeks, 12 weeks. I mean, if you were originally working with them, what would be the number of weeks that you're kind of planning in your head? Yeah,
I usually try to plan 12 weeks ahead.
All right.
And then I'll break that down. And I know a lot of people, think that deloads are stupid, whatever you want to call it. I think the term can be interpreted in many different ways.
Well, it's essentially just programming.
Exactly. Yeah. So based on the individual, what they respond to, how hard we can push them in a certain amount of time, that's how I will program in their lighter weeks or their deload weeks or their reload weeks. But I'm always thinking about it in up to like, hey, what do we want to do over this 12-week period, and how do we want to break it down into chunks? And then when we're coming up on a meet, I pull that backwards. And I'm like, okay, this is where we want to be. This is what their work schedule is. This is their vacation they have coming, or not vacation, but their work trip that they have coming up. And I work backwards off of that. And that'll say, they got a work trip on this day and this day. That means we got 3 weeks for that first block, 4 weeks for the next one. And that's kind of how we map it out. That's how I break it up and take that 12 weeks and break it up.
Mm-hmm. If you have the meet is the benchmark of where mm-hmm. the measurement, right, of where they're at. What are the metrics that are tracking if they're leading towards that mm-hmm. in the program?
So, I mean, me personally, I track metrics outside of training as well. Mm-hmm. Are you asking about that too?
Yes.
Okay. So sleep and recovery is huge, because not a single person that I train is at the pinnacle of the sport. Those people who are up there, they have a little bit better grasp on, their lifestyle. A lot of people I coach are full-time parents. They're professionals. I have a couple people who work 3 jobs, and it's really preparing for all of that.
What are the
metrics?
The metrics.
Really, the way that I keep track of everybody's training for that, when you are more of a novice and intermediate lifter, what's going to propel them, in my opinion, are repetition PRs. Because when you're novice and intermediate, sometimes you get in your head when you're talking about singles, doubles, triples. I save a lot of that for closer to the meet, or maybe to start at the very, like, week 1 of a new block, and I'll just throw it in there and say, mm-hmm. hey man, I want you to work up to a near max single today, and just throw them off so they don't expect it. But most people, they're going to get the most out of pushing themselves on sets of 5. Shit, sometimes when they're coming off of a meet, I'll push them in sets of 8 at the beginning of a meet prep. Stuff like that. I'll throw in like a 5th set approach every now and then, so they don't think about it. Mm-hmm. But they're not intimidated by the weight on the bar, because they know it's not near the 1 rep max. But if I say, hey, I'm going to have you do a 5th set, you're doing 4 doubles, and then you're going to do this 1 set to RPE 9, they don't care. All they do is push themselves on that last set, and next thing they know, they hit a rep PR, and then they're building that. And then as time goes, we get closer to increasing the intensity, decreasing the volume as we go into the meet.
Okay.
Singles, doubles, triples, or triples, doubles, singles, sets, stuff like that.
And then what's the training look like after the meet's over?
It depends on what they have going on, and what they, it's all about what the client wants and what the client needs. So if they say, hey man, that was great, but my kid has summer league baseball for the next 3 months. Okay. How many days a week can you dedicate to training? 3 right now. And how long can the training sessions be? Dude, an hour, because I get off work, I can train for an hour, and then I got to go to baseball. So that might be a lot of supersets. That might be just conditioning work, heavy carries, sled drags. Maybe we're doing like 10 sets of 10 dumbbell press and a couple other accessories. If it's somebody who says, hey man, that was a great meet, and I want to get back into another meet in a couple months, then dude, we're coming in and we're throwing in a variation. Mm-hmm. The first week, I always have everybody not take completely off. If they need it, I have them take off. I think there's a good approach to that, physically and mentally, lets you reset. But I'll have them come in and I say, hey, you're not touching a barbell for this first week after the meet. And what I want you to do is I want you to reflect on your meet prep, on your meet performance, how you think you did. So it's a learning opportunity. That first week after a training session is for us to build a stronger relationship. And then we have a call. We do a 1-hour call that week, and we talk about where we're going to go, what their goals are, what they have going on in life. And will drive the programming going forward.
Now let's flip it to your own training. Let's assume that you're off season, you're through your off season, you're where you need to be, mm-hmm. you're healthy, everything's established where it should be, and you're 12 weeks out from the meet. Mm-hmm. How does that progress into the meet?
So that my training will be dictated off of where I failed in my previous meet and what needs to be worked on. So if I needed, like, let's say the meet prep before, I did a lot of variation work. Maybe I was doing a lot of SSB work leading into the meet and I didn't do enough on the straight bar. Then man, I didn't do enough in reps. That was a big one for me. That's what took my total, the biggest jump up to 2000 is I spent more time in reps. Whereas in the past, I may have only done reps like 6 to 8 weeks going into the meet. Well, I spent 14 weeks in reps with either a buffalo bar or a straight bar on my back to replicate what I was going to experience in the meet under a heavy load. Mm-hmm. So it was all about where I needed to get better and where my weak points were coming off of the previous meet. And that would drive the direction as soon as I got back into training.
So where were the reps being for the first block of this?
Oh, dude, 5s, 6s.
So you're still hitting those now?
Yeah.
You jump in at the 5s.
Yeah. So it's usually a variation. So, and it's usually accommodating resistance of some sort. Like if I could pick my all-time favorite for building a squat, for me, it was jumping in, squatting against chains. A lot of chains. And for me,
it's a lot.
Sometimes I work up to 6 per side.
Mm-hmm.
And we would take different approaches. Like sometimes I would start with 2 chains and then each week keep the bar weight the same and add a chain. Sometimes I would start off keep the chain weight the same and add weight on the bar. But for me, it became, when I started getting up into those heavier weights, I mean, I was lifting weights that at one time I never thought I would be lifting. And for me, it became a mental thing. So when I was doing, different forms of accommodating resistance with chains, especially, I couldn't relate it to straight weight. I'm like, okay, this is going to feel like 5 plates plus a bunch of chains. I don't know what that meant as far as the standard number of a competition weight that I was used to. So I just pushed myself. That's all I knew was like, whatever this weight is, I'm going to push it 100%. So I would do that as long as I could before switching to the specificity of the meet.
How many weeks do you need for that specificity to happen?
Well, that changes throughout your lifting career. Early on, it would be a lot more. As I got towards the end, I think I did, when I went into the meet where I totaled 2000, I did 5 weeks, straight weight, straight bar. And that's all I need.
Does that include the deload before?
No, the deload, I just did belt squat.
Okay.
And that's one thing I always did on my deload weeks was I would do belt squat instead of put a bar on my back.
All right. What about the deadlift and bench then?
So the deadlift, I would only do 2 to 3 sessions from the floor, competition movement, specific lift before I went into a meet. Besides that, I was doing block pulls and speed pulls.
So there's a deadlift every week?
Yeah, I would still deadlift every week.
And then the bench. And now is this once a week for each lift?
I would bench twice a week.
All right.
Squat once a week, deadlift once a week.
So what do the benches look like?
Bench, I would have a dedicated maximal effort with a variation, fat bar, floor press, benching against chains. I would only do the competition lift the last, 4 to 5 weeks of training. And then my secondary day was speed work, bands and chains, your typical dynamic effort work.
In what percentage range?
45, 50.
All right. So the weight really didn't matter.
No.
That's kind of what I'm getting from you. It was the intent.
Yeah.
It had to feel, this would be a good one here. It had to feel a certain way, right? If it felt too easy, a little more weight went on. If it felt too, explain to me in your words what that optimal weight feels like.
Okay.
Or the optimal weight. You know what I'm saying.
Yes.
But it's not as very easy to explain.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I think this is the reason why a lot of people think that dynamic effort work and speed work is a bunch of bullshit. It's because they don't know how to produce the force to get out of it what it's intended to be used for. For me, and this is where my background was, I was already very good at producing power and knowing what that was supposed to feel like. So for me, when that bar rate really started to slow down, and I had no way to measure it. I didn't use a bar speed measurement device. But if I got to, say, my 8th, 9th, or 10th set, and I felt like I was slowing down, then that was either my fault, mentally, or physically I wasn't prepared to do that many sets with 60 seconds rest, or the weight was actually a little bit too heavy. Because I never wanted to get to the point where the bar was actually slowing down towards the later sets. I like to end that training session, if I could make my last set the best one that I did and just feel like an absolute mutant, then that was the goal.
Now, was there any waving to that, or was it what I just call like a straight wave? You're just basing it based on how that feels that day and how it's moving?
Well, I would always, so week one, so the first time I ever did this, Casey programmed it for me. And then when I started, training myself, I just would go based off of what I did that first time. And I tried to always start my dynamic work a little bit ahead of what I was doing back then. But it would start, week one was a percentage. And then I would just add a percentage, or add weight each week. So it was like 5 or 10 pounds each week, and do it for 4 weeks. And then when I came off of that, I would do, say, a band and a chain. And that would be basically, I did, going into a meet, I would do dynamic effort work for 8 weeks going into a meet, and then cut it at like 4 to 3 weeks out. And every time I would come back around to it, the first set of 4 weeks, I was, it was just doubled reds. And I would try to start a little bit above what I did the previous meet prep.
So there's some progressive overload in there, where a lot of people will do that. And some mistakes that can happen with that, if they're not in touch with what that force is supposed to feel like, is it becomes non-optimal, and it becomes really not what you're looking to accomplish. Where one of the hardest things I've had to explain to a lot of people is, sometimes that first week, sometimes you can use the same weight for 4 weeks, but it gets more explosive. It feels more explosive over the 4 weeks. And it will get to a point to where now it feels like it's too light. So it doesn't have to be a week to week progression. It can be, this weight starts, maybe it's a little bit too slow, but then after the 4 weeks, it's really good. Then the weight increases and goes that way. It's a lot more like a flat wave. And the reason I say that is, as we were going through a lot of this, a lot of the times the weight just never changed, or the bands just never changed. We just got better, at doing all that. And especially with the dynamic work on the bench, a lot of people are so fixated on this has to increase. And it's, when you look at it from a broad overview, it's like, well, like 1 or 2 of those weeks actually did what it was supposed to do. Right. All the others didn't. So then over that whole year, 3/4 of it didn't do, what I'm saying? What it was supposed to do. It was just submaximal lifting. It probably too much volume. Which, even if it just take all this away and just say it's submaximal training, and that's all you did, then it's still too much volume.
Well, and that's when being that powerful is something is hard to teach. I don't care how much you do speed work. Some people just aren't going to develop that. And sometimes they'll just beat their head against the wall because they know that they're not moving it as well as they should be. So that's where you really have to, and this is about being in touch with your clients and knowing them. And it's a fine line, because you don't want to discourage them. So you got to really precisely pick your approach. And one example that I'll do is I'll just add a set each week. So maybe week 1, they're doing 6 triples. And then week 2, they're doing 7 triples. And then week 3, they're doing 8 triples, same weight, same resistance. And that will build their confidence. And it's also giving them more chances to move that weight more efficiently.
Yes. Well, for some people too, if it's just not there, a submaximal approach is going to be better.
Exactly.
So it won't be effective for them because the ability to produce force it changes as you get stronger, as you know, right? Which is why you can't prescribe the same type of volume for an 800-pound squatter.
Right.
You're not going to do 6 sets of 3 at 90%. Right. Or, it's just, and especially if you're super explosive.
Yeah.
Because then after the first 2, you're done.
Yeah. Right.
Because you're utilizing more muscle, with each contraction that you're doing than somebody that doesn't have that all synchronized, for lack of a better word.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because, one of my females that I coach right now at Union Fitness was a track athlete, was in gymnastics, very, very explosive. And then I coach another gentleman who doesn't really have much of a sports background, very little, and they move very differently. And she can apply force very easily. So the other day we were squatting, they're coming up on a meet, and she goes, "Hey, why am I only doing, 2 triples on my back down work, and such is doing, 3 triples at a different percentage?" And I go, "Well, this is because this is what you respond to. You can get a ton out of very, few sets and less weight, because the force the input that she's putting into each rep is much higher." And that goes, typically that's what they say about females, right? Is they need more overall volume, more overall work. Well, that obviously you have outliers.
Yeah.
And you got to, as a coach, you got to understand who it is that you're coaching.
With your own business, now that you've had it long enough to be able to answer this question, what are some things you wish you knew before you started it that you know now?
Oh man, that's such a hard question. Some things that I wish I knew. Well, was that you can't run a successful business without understanding business. And that's funny, but everything that I had done up to this point, I was a trainer, I was a strength and conditioning coach, and then I did a little bit of directing at Union Fitness. And that was when I realized, like, dude, you got to manage a lot more. You got to understand the ins and outs of business. And then when I decided that I wanted to start my own coaching business online, I knew how to communicate and coach people very well, but I didn't know how to manage the ins and outs of the business very well. And I hired Paul O'Need. Casey gave me some help with that because Casey has a good background in business. But as far as being a powerlifting coach, I met Paul. He came down to visit Todd at Union Fitness because Paul he was a GA at RMU when Todd was there. And a couple of weeks after that, I actually told Paul that I wanted to work with him, and he mentored me on the ins and outs of business, finances, budgeting, all these things that like you learn when you're younger. I don't know if they do anymore, but you touch on it, but you don't realize how much that's going to impact you as a self-reliant coach. I'm the only person who I can rely on to run my business and be successful and put food on the table. And Paul told me, "Hey man, sit down." Cause I told him I was ready to leave Union Fitness. I said, "But I don't think I can financially." And he goes, "Well, sit down, put your entire budget together. And if you're $1 in the green, I want you to put in your notice and I want you to start your own business." And that's when I was like, oh shit, there's a lot that I have to learn about this. So as far as business goes, from a non-coaching standpoint, it was actually how to understand and have a successful business and not just doing it as a side gig, and how to do it for a long period of time and grow it. How many people do you know that get into coaching, especially online coaching? There's a million online coaches that do it for a couple of years and then they're gone, because I don't think they realize what goes into it.
Well, I think most are doing it as a side hustle just to be able to help pay for the sport that they compete in. Yeah. And that's a big percentage of all that. What were some of the hardest parts of the business for you to grasp? Because now you're dealing with learning things that you really probably aren't that interested in, but you have to learn. So you have the finance, the marketing, you have all these different components that kind of play into that. What was the one, let's just make them easy. What was the one component that was the hardest to have the motivation to actually want to dig into?
Yeah, it was how to make my clients the absolute best that they could be through a computer. And how could I relay most efficiently the things that I wanted them to work on? And if they didn't grasp it the first time around, that I can't get frustrated with myself or with them, and I got to stay consistent, and I'm learning throughout this process. And something that I say to one person, maybe as far as a cue goes, or, hey, I want you to do this, that's going to be completely different from my other person. And, when you're in powerlifting, and a lot of people, for the most part, when you're competing at a certain level, everybody understands the same cues. And shit, you could call it something completely different and you're going to understand it. Well, that's not it with coaching these people through a computer. So the different things that I'm able to do with the different programs, with the different apps, I'm able to talk to them. I'm able to break down their form through the screen as I'm talking about it, knowing how to speak to them and understanding that each person is going to respond differently. And people's level of coachability is drastically different. Some people constantly need a pat on the back. Other people need hey, get your head out of your ass. Let's go. And I'm used to that because that's how I was. And that's how Casey was to me. But my background in being a personal trainer helped me understand the other side of it, because most people who I was working with as a personal trainer aren't the all-in athletes. They just want to get a little bit better. So it's a lot of positive affirmation, influence, things like that. So the hardest part was, if I'm taking X amount of clients that I'm speaking with and helping all throughout the week, not just one day, how do I constantly have this dialogue with them that's going to continue to progress them? And if they do get in a rut mentally, how do we have that conversation? What do I need to say to be honest with them, to still push them, but that's not going to discourage them, or that's going to discourage them as little as possible?
Now, when you're looking at the planning of the business, because you mentioned earlier with the training, it was meet to meet, right? So with the business, is it quarter to quarter, or are you looking at a quadrennial to be able to, here's where you want it to be? And then is it more long-term than the powerlifting from meet to meet?
Well, if it's somebody who...
No, I'm talking yourself as the business.
Break that down for me.
All right. So with inbound, right? Yeah. You're going to have certain goals and metrics associated with that. Are those built around Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4? Or is it, here's where I want it to be in 4 years, and then working it back from there? Because as the power lifter, you were just going from here to here, which would say be a quarter, right? Where, how do you approach, because now it's different thinking, but a lot of the lessons in training can be applied to business and vice versa. So
it's kind of a combination. It's yearly. I understand where I want to be at the end of the year because I know where I was the previous year, but it's also where I want to be quarterly as well, based off of the quarter from last year, because a lot of this is kind of seasonal. When clients come and go, like I have some clients that I've worked with since the very beginning for 5-6 years, and they've stuck with me that entire time. But a lot of this is powerlifting has seasons. Kind of when you live around this area, there's certain times that you're going to train. When you're in Pittsburgh, it's nice like 2 months out of the year. So they're probably not going to be training for a meet during that time. So I can track that data and see, okay, this quarter last year, this is where I was, and what do I need to do to better that. And one of the best things that I did was stay working with Paul in a group mentorship. So, we do a weekly check-in and we do a weekly group call, and we're always talking about things, how do we continue to grow? And, there were some times where it's hard to stay motivated when you're doing this, with a coaching business. And you may have for no reason other than people are coming and going. Last December, I lost 5 clients because one of them was getting married, one of them was having a kid, one of them was starting a new job and couldn't do it, and one of them just didn't want to do it anymore. And it's like, shit, what did I do? What do I need to do going forward? So then it's really sitting down and you got to figure out, what was it that brought these people in the first place? Because whatever that was, that's what I need to do more of. So it's looking at data from previous years and quarters, but it's also seeing where you're at in that moment and what you need. I'm a father now, and I watch my daughter 3 days a week. So I can't, even if I wanted to bring in more people, if that takes away, or if it makes it too stressful between taking care of my daughter and running the business, I can't bring on new clients. So it's a balance of where I'm at myself within the season as well.
Were there any topics you wanted to talk about that I didn't bring up?
I think one of my training partners actually, he said, I want you to go on there and talk about the importance of a training crew. Because, and I don't know if it's from COVID or not, but you see fewer and fewer people training in a crew. There was a time when a crew was required. Like, you guys had to have a crew. Yeah. I mean, you're not getting in a squat suit or a bench shirt.
Well, it was like that even before the gear.
Right.
Because I was doing this before the gear got
exactly
too.
Yeah. But now you're seeing, and I see it a lot on like a collegiate level, where I see people coming in and just doing their own thing by themselves. I think there's a benefit to that, because the days that I train alone, I can really think, I can decipher information, my own cueing, what I need to do. I can step back and not have to talk to somebody else. But when you're really trying to push things, you have no idea what you're capable of until you're training with people who know their shit, who have done what you're trying to do, but are willing to push you harder and past what you think you're possible, what you're capable of. And without the crew that I had when I moved up here, I wouldn't have accomplished the things that I did on the platform or off of the platform with business. And I think I think training crews are becoming a lost art. They're still out there, don't get me wrong. And there are some people out there who are the best lifters in the world who train alone. So it's not for everybody, but I think for the majority of people, they would benefit more from seeking out and finding people who they can train with and resonate with, who are on the same path, who have very similar goals, to push each other.
How would you suggest they go about doing that?
This isn't the answer people want to hear, but do it the same way I did it. I mean, unfortunately, remember the days of people coming out here for learn to trains and underground training sessions? People don't want to do that anymore because everybody thinks they can find the answers that they want on the internet, and they can find some, but there's certain things you cannot gain unless you go out and find people.
I don't know with those events, because it's to think this through, it should be easier to find people to train with today than before.
Well, there's much more people
there's way more people, but there's also access to those people. So when I hate this, when I back in my day, there was no internet.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So you had to ask. It was much harder.
Right.
But when I would go to a new city or college or whatever it is, it's calling the gyms to say, do you have any powerlifters that are there? Asking other people at meets, stuff like that. So it was harder, right, to find that, but yet everybody had crews.
Yeah.
Right, because of the whole thing. Where now it's much easier because of that. But I don't think with those type of events, yes, people were coming for the seminar ones. They were coming to be able to learn, but they came more for the experience of just being, because they wanted to train with other people. Right, the learning part of like an underground or some just pure training event was secondary. You weren't sitting there like, I want to go here because I'm going to learn shit.
Right.
It was like, I want to go here because I want to train with these people and it's going to be fucking awesome.
Yes.
Right. So I don't think it's the learning, you see what I'm saying? I don't think it's the learning part. It's more the experience part.
Yeah.
Where there's a little disconnect that's kind of going on because younger generations will now invest more in experiences than they will, say, education. Right. So that's what's that weird kind of disconnect, with that. So it's the appetite's there, but I don't know if they're seeing those type of things as experiences, because a meet would be, yes, you're going there to be able to test yourself, but you're also going there because it's the community and it's the environment and it's seeing people that you haven't seen for a while. So the first one was really the real main one for everybody. That's like the test.
Right.
After that, you're going back because you liked not just maxing out testing and seeing how well you did, but the experience.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So,
and I think back when you guys were competing, how many of you guys legitimately wanted to beat the other person and wanted to be the best? Like a lot of you guys, right? I think you're seeing a shift away from that because I think people are finding that they can gain other things from powerlifting. So powerlifting was super, super competitive when I started and 100% when you were into it. But now you're finding it as an outlet, which is also really cool because it doesn't matter how it's helping somebody. Like if it's helping somebody, that's awesome. But you're seeing a shift away from it being about people wanting to be the absolute best and the best that they can, and to kind of just do it for more of like something to do. And I think if that's what you're doing, that's why you see some people who are fine just training with themselves. Yeah. As opposed to, if you want to be the best you can be, you're going to find other people.
Well, that would come with growth, right? Because if you look at the number of competitors in the USA last year, it's like maybe 50,000 that are in there, which would be maybe twice what it was when I was competing, based upon the best numbers I could get.
Right.
Like Powerlifting USA subscriptions.
Right.
Some federations would tell you how many members they had. Most would not. I only knew of 2 of the federations because I was associated with them to be able to kind of know. But that was a good estimate of what it was that Ricky Crane was able to kind of solidify. We both kind of agreed it was about that number. So you would see 2 times growth. Right. But it's not 2 times growth, because what didn't really exist when I was competing was what you would call recreational powerlifters, right?
Exactly.
There's the bodybuilding side, we call it like closet bodybuilders, right? It's a joking term, where now you have that, right? At a scale that is really hard to measure, but I would say it's tenfold.
Yeah.
Right. So now the 50,000, becomes, well, probably not tenfold, but 200,000, right? So these would be, they like the 3 lifts. They like to test themselves on the 3 lifts. They really don't give a fuck about the competing that much. And that just comes with growth, right? So but it can be, what's the word I'm looking for? It can be misinterpreted as the total growth of the sport.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And to mean now there's 100,000 competitors, 50,000 still a lot. 50,000 might be the same number as hockey players. I'd have to GPT this to be able to know.
Right.
But it's still a lot. It's still double, which is out there. But when it brings in those and recreate, I don't mean to downgrade, what it is, but it's a different type of lifter.
It is
than what's in there. But that different type of lifter provides the opportunity for people like yourself and other people that are coming up through the powerlifting, because the likelihood that you're going to get very serious competitors as clients is pretty low.
Yeah.
Right. Across the board.
Yep.
Right. I jokingly say with the business, as soon as somebody actually gets on open powerlifting, they're probably never buying from us.
Right.
Because it's that low
right.
on what the percentage of market share that actually becomes. And that's kind of across the board with a lot of businesses that are in this sector. But the opportunity for growth with the other population is what feeds, can feed into it.
Yep.
And with that's going to come frustrations for those that have competed. You know, you're closer to it because you're closer from your last meet was last year. So you're still in it. The biggest bitches and complaints I hear are people that are my age that are they've been disconnected for so long that they still don't understand why people are lifting raw.
Yeah, right.
You know,
exactly.
So that's a whole different discussion all in itself, because they don't see, you know, all the underbellies
That's right.
of what's going on, and there's pros and cons that are with everything that are associated with there, and that. So then when we peel it back into the crew thing, is it still the same number or is it double what you see? I don't know.
That's a good point.
I don't know, right? Yeah. Because we're looking at one demographic and assuming it's this demographic, right? We're looking at the recreational and assuming that it's the competitive.
Yep.
Right? Where why would the recreational want to train with a fucking, you know what I'm saying?
That's a very good point.
Like, why would they? If I'm a recreational fucking shooter, like, do I want to go to the range with fucking 10 other people?
You just want to go by yourself.
Right now, if I'm a competitive one, I probably, you know what I'm saying? I probably do. Yeah. So when trying to answer that question, you got to peel back some layers
100%.
To be able to know. And that I don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's as disrupted as what people think it is because they're looking at it through the wrong lens.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. But it still would benefit them either way, right? Because if we peel it, now I like to go the other look at. If you look at the clients that you were training in Union Fitness and compare the ones that you were training one-to-one to the ones that you were training in small groups, which ones made better progress?
Small groups.
Of course.
Yeah.
So it still applies.
Exactly.
You see what I'm saying? So it still applies.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit harder sale when it's not in person and, you know, Billy knows John. You know, and you can put them together in one session.
Right.
But as soon as that happens, synergy happens.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
Sometimes you just got to give it a chance.
Yes.
But that's the hard part.
Yes. So did you have any other topics?
I mean, I got topics all day, but we don't have enough time. So maybe we'll save it for another time.
All right. Yeah. Okay. That's good. How can people find you?
They can find me at on Instagram at Curtis_Miller_Ironbound. Email. People still email? People still email. Yeah. ironboundstrength1@gmail.com. And I travel to a lot of meets. I mean, I just got back from Texas. This Saturday, I'll be in West Virginia at a meet there. I'll be in Pittsburgh at a meet in a couple weeks. There's a good chance that if you're going to a meet, you know, in the Pittsburgh, Maryland, West Virginia, Ohio area, that you'll see me there. And if you see me there, do not hesitate to come up, talk, introduce yourself, ask any question. That's one of the biggest things I love about this sport and is meeting people and traveling places. Very cool. I have a gift bag for you here. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. Go ahead and pop that open real quick. There's a shirt in there. There's some Element packs. Their sponsor, link in the bio. And then the notebooks I have custom made from Pioneer. They make our powerlifting belts. And then in that book, there's a coin that's kind of like a challenge cord reward coin. That's something that I've been giving out to people for the past 5 years that I feel embody the reason why I started the company in the first place, which is to live, learn, and pass on. And I believe you do that very well. Appreciate that. And keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate it. And I just want to say one thing. You know, I just want to thank you and Elite FTS because, as you heard at the beginning of this conversation, legitimately shaped the direction that I decided to go with my life, my career. And I'm sure you know that with a lot of people, but I don't think you realize it quite as much as you do. So I think I speak for everybody by saying thank you for everything that you guys do. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yep. And we're done. All content you see on this channel and at elitefts.com is created by, take a guess,
Elite FTS. If you want to help support the content, head over to elitefts.com and pick up literally anything